Hey everyone, it's been a really eventful year for the video game industry. On one hand, we have huge numbers of layoffs, multiple games underperforming, which sometimes even led to the closure of their studio. We've also seen multiple delays, even more cancellations, and the list just goes on. It's honestly really easy to concentrate on the negatives, as this year seems to be particularly intense, but I think that now more than ever, we should actually concentrate on the good that happened throughout the year. I think that 2023 is going to be a year that people will remember, and it's with that kind of dedication that I decided to make this video. I essentially want to talk about all the major events that all AAA companies had to face this year. I essentially want to talk about each company's revenue streams, how their games perform, and how it will affect their prospects for the future. I want to also analyze their options, talk about the general performance of their games, and all the controversies related to their release. Money talks, and it's by understanding how and where it's going that will allow us to understand why certain trends are as popular as they are, and why gaming has changed in the way that it did, because it's changed a lot, and it will only get more interesting and dramatic as the years go by. Now, before we get into it, I want to mention a few things real quick. First of all, I'll be covering the companies in alphabetical order, which means that you can definitely skip around and watch whatever part interests you the most. Although, I don't recommend it, as I believe that the more you know, the clearer your general vision of the industry will be. Also, I don't have enough subscribers or viewers to be able to put timestamps on the video itself, but if you go in my video description, you'll find it written there for your convenience. Secondly, because my goal is to rapidly go over all the facts that I find relevant for each company, I therefore won't be able to cover anything in detail. I can't imagine how much bigger this video would be if, as its current state, it already has 27 word pages filled with sources used to feed the discussion. Just know that all information found in this video is easily searchable on Google, and I strongly encourage you to do that on subjects that pique your interest, as there's often more to the stories told here. That also indirectly leads me to my next point, which is that even if I did a lot of research, and I believe that what I'm presenting here stands on its own 2 feet and is objectively true, I might have still missed something along the way. Do let me know if I missed something or I got something wrong in the comments section of the video. I will read through all of them, and if I do think that you're right, or at least you've added something that I find interesting, I will add it in the video description of the video. Although, rest assured though, I did my best to cover everything that I could find, so I hope that the quality of the content speaks for itself. Speaking of content, if you're new to this channel, just know that this isn't the kind of content that I usually make. I usually do retrospectives on games or in-depth reviews on newly released games, so this is definitely abnormal for my channel. Although, it has one thing in common with the rest of my content, and it's that I strongly believe that the information found below is important. I encourage everyone to follow the industry, as knowledge is power and allows you to properly vote with your wallet. Therefore, if you want things to change, if you want games to be made in a healthy environment, and if you want better games overall, we need to stay informed, and it's with that kind of dedication that I went into this project. I certainly learned a lot when writing the script, and if you end up feeling the same way, do like and subscribe. I sincerely appreciate it. With all that said, let's actually start off this video with probably the most controversial company in my whole list, which is obviously Activision. Probably know already, Microsoft started acquiring Activision Blizzard King last year, and that $68.7 billion deal is finally entering its finalization phase. I won't get too much into the details, as I'm sure that most of you are generally aware of the situation, although as a quick overview, it took them more than 20 months for Microsoft to complete the deal. It had to essentially convince multiple agencies and governments that the acquisition wouldn't turn them into a monopoly. In other words, some groups thought that the acquisition would make them choke the competition, essentially destroying consumer choice, and therefore would limit technologies being built in the future. The most vocal of the oppositions was Sony, as they felt that Microsoft getting Call of Duty would put a huge damper on their revenue. Interesting enough though, Call of Duty brings around $1 billion in sales just on the PlayStation Store alone, so there is indeed some merit to the whole ordeal. Although, what's actually funny is how fast the story turns when an email from the CEO leaked, which states that Microsoft won't pull the game from PlayStation, essentially proving that this was all them buying time rather than actually worrying about the bottom line. I know that this sounds hypocritical, and it sort of is when considering that Sony keeps buying exclusivity rights for games while complaining that Microsoft is doing the same thing, but on the other hand, that's actually his job. The CEO is paid to, among other things, push back and politically hinder the competition while creating as much fertile ground for Sony as possible. Plus, the longer the deal takes to complete, the more Microsoft needs to pay in penalties to Bobby Kotick, so it works in his favor nonetheless. One additional thing that came out of this is that the UK's Competition and Market Authority raised concerns stating that Microsoft is already too involved in all streaming technologies and that the acquisition would make it practically impossible for the competition to catch up. Microsoft's solution was therefore to sell the rights to Ubisoft, which means that they now get to control what cloud service platforms all Activision games can and will appear in the next 15 years. Funny enough though, that also means that they have the rights to license it back to Microsoft so that it can appear in the Xbox Cloud Gaming, which kind of beats the purpose, but whatever. This all brings me to the meat of the subject, which is what does it mean for Activision Blizzard King to be acquired by Microsoft? Well, in order to answer that, we need to analyze the current state of the company, which is honestly abysmal. Let's start with the Activision side of things. It's honestly no secret that Activision placed all of its eggs in the Call of Duty basket. Long gone are the days where they used to create and publish games on multiple licenses like Prototype, James Bond, and even Guitar Hero. Now, they just mostly create Call of Duty games every year. Although, there are exceptions like the excellent Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2 remake and Crash Bandicoot 4, but those are rare and far in between. Fun fact, maybe the reason we don't see that many variety in their releases is because their other games ain't bringing that sweet Call of Duty money. Just to give you an idea, Crash Team Rumble released in June of this year and no sales figures were ever released, but we did get a funny article that states that the launch of Peppa Pig on the PlayStation Plus was bigger than the one from Crash Team Rumble. Basically, a 2-year-old game had more active PlayStation accounts than those playing Crash Team Rumble a few weeks after release, which is honestly fucking hilarious. Tony Hawk Skater 1 and 2 did better, selling 1 million copies in less than 2 weeks, which is decent, but too small for Activision. It's probably for those reasons and more that Call of Duty unfortunately has a yearly release schedule. It brings in the sales that the board of directors require and more, but also means that it doesn't allow the team the time to innovate and make anything else, and it shows. Most of the sentiment around the games are negative as fans complain that they're getting too repetitive, bug-filled, and infested with microtransactions. Even last year's Modern Warfare 2, which was received well and was sold even better, is now getting a lot of questionable cosmetics that gives players advantages on the battlefield. For example, the skin you see on screen lets the player start with 2 armor plates instead of 1, making you more resistant than the newly spawned player. There's also another cosmetic pack called the Bomb Squad, which lets people carry a medium backpack from the start, allowing them to start the game with the ability of immediately carrying 3 weapons instead of 2. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong idea and presume that this kind of bullshit is new to Call of Duty, because it absolutely isn't. Activision has had a long history of stripping their games and selling its leftovers for a quick buck, with this one being my favorite. $2 for a smiley face reticle, please. Although, if you thought this was bad, you still haven't heard what's been happening with this year's Call of Duty. Basically, Activision promised that they were finally going to skip a year after 2 decades of constant release. The change was motivated by the poor sales and general performance of Call of Duty Vanguard, as well as the worry that they may be oversaturating the market, which is funny for its own way, but you'll see why in a few seconds. Their general plan was therefore to skip 2023, but as compensation, they were going to release a premium expansion for Modern Warfare 2. Obviously that never happened, as they rapidly changed their minds and stated in February of this year that they were going to keep with traditions and release a new game in November. Fast forward to now, and do let me know if you think it paid off. Fun fact, this year's Call of Duty is also the most worst reviewed game in the whole franchise. The reason for this is quite simple. The single player gameplay is 4 hours long at maximum, and it still reuses assets from Modern Warfare 2 and somehow feels bloated even with its short runtime. The multiplayer also feels like an update to Modern Warfare 2 and not like a full release as usual. Lastly, zombie mode feels uninspired and stale compared to the previous iterations. Basically, it feels like a DLC that was sold as a standalone game, which it probably was. Although, stating that Call of Duty is entirely losing its touch wouldn't entirely be true, because unlike the main entry in the series, the mobile version of Call of Duty is actually excelling in every way. Since its launch in October 2019, it has generated $3 billion in revenue, and more impressive still, the game brings around 90 million players on a regular basis. That's more than half of the player base found in the main entries, so all in all, it's really impressive to see it thrive in such a fierce environment. It shows that no matter how much Activision repeatedly fucks up, fans are ready to bounce around until they find something that works for them, which means that Activision is extremely lucky to have that kind of fan base. Now it's time to talk about Blizzard Entertainment, which is doing better, but not by much. They released their most anticipated Diablo 4 in June, and the original reception was originally really good. They sold more than 10 million copies in 3 months, and with the in-game purchases, they made more than $1 billion in sales. It's all really good news, but the interesting part is that the hype died out pretty rapidly. More more cracks were starting to show as gamers got to the end game. They all essentially realized that the game was missing a lot of key features and felt way too grindy. The Season 1 content was also unsatisfying, so people left for greener pastures, and pretty fast, mind you. Plus, Baldur's Gate 3 released about 2 months after Diablo 4, and as that game reviewed way better and had way more content, people left to experience the new hype. Additionally, Path of Exiles 1 and 2 was also getting a lot of hype and was luring in players that normally would have stayed with Diablo. Both Path of Exile and Baldur's Gate 3 reviewed better and had more balanced content, so the struggle was real for Blizzard Entertainment. The good news is that Season 2 released about a month ago for Diablo, and it brought a lot of things that fans wanted out of the game. Hopefully, they can continue down the path and get the game to the state that will honor its name. Although, the path forward is still really mixed because, as much as they do bring the desired content, they also fill their games with a lot of shitty microtransactions. It is indeed under Activision, so that kind of disappointment is only normal nowadays. Speaking of microtransactions, Diablo Immortals made $500 million in just its first year alone. That number must be higher now as most Blizzard games are now no longer available in China, with the exception of Diablo Immortal. You might have forgotten this story as it happened at the beginning of the year, but basically, you need an intermediate in order to bring the games from the West into the Eastern market. So, with Eddie's gone and no one there to fill in their shoes, Activision Blizzard was forced to close all servers for the games in China. You can imagine the blow that must be to Activision, as China is their second biggest market, as it represented 15% of their total revenue for Blizzard. The following numbers were released in 2018, so they're definitely outdated, but keep in mind that if they're this high, then they're even higher nowadays as gaming is becoming more accessible to more people. Anyways, it seems that in 2018, China generated $37.9 billion in revenue for the gaming industry that year, with a whopping $23 billion that came from the mobile games. $14.4 billion came from the PC market, and a miserable sum of $60 million came from consoles. Now you know why the push for mobile games is so big, because the amount coming not just from China, but the whole Asian market is just huge. Just to give you even more insight, the same article states that in the same year, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East combined made $28.7 billion compared to China's $37.9. Now that the situation has changed and Activision Blizzard is out of China, it will be interesting to see how Microsoft deals with the whole situation, because they'll definitely want to snuggle back with China as soon as possible. Also, I forgot to add this in the script, but the reason Diablo Immortals is still in there is because for some reason that game was on a separate contract from everything else, so that one basically fell through, but Diablo Immortals is still being provided by NetEase. If someone has more info on this, please let me know, because I honestly couldn't find anything and I have absolutely no idea, but that seems to be the current situation. The final game that I want to cover from Blizzard is Overwatch. That game used to be the pinnacle of the multiplayer gaming, with tons of players either playing it or watching streamers on Twitch. Now, since it got somewhat rebooted at release of Overwatch 2, its legacy is practically destroyed. Its stats are down compared to before, and fans generally aren't happy with the way that the game has been managed. Too many changes were made for the worse, and that sentiment was reflected when the game released on Steam, becoming the worst reviewed game on the platform. That's not to say that the game was bad. Fans were just angry that Overwatch 1 was deleted and replaced with a product that doesn't justify its existence while adding even more microtransactions. To be fair though, Overwatch 1 cost money in order to play it, but came with some free cosmetics that could be earned by playing during specific events. Overwatch 2 did the opposite by being free to play and charging more for event skins than in the previous game. Also, when the skins started popping up on the digital store, most fans felt ripped off, and with the devs not being able to convince fans that the deletion of Overwatch 1 was for the better of the license from the consumer standpoint, a lot of fans basically left the game altogether. This mismanagement and general dissatisfaction is also represented by the cancellation of the Overwatch League. It basically wasn't in their interest to keep it going when the views and the money returns were dwindling, so they closed it basically for good. The teams got a $6 million bonus, and that's the end of that. Although, it wouldn't be fair if I just left it at that and didn't mention that the game isn't really dead as most people will lead you to believe. Steam numbers are actually pretty healthy, and there's still a lot of activity on Twitch. It's just that the hype and general player investment from before is mostly gone, and seeing them do one misstep after another has weighed on a lot of people, which is a general feeling for all of their games nowadays. The only company in the trio which is actually well and kicking is obviously King. Interestingly enough, most people forget that Activision also owns Candy Crush, and do you know how much money that game makes? Well, since its creation in 2012, Candy Crush has brought in around $20 billion in revenue and another $5 billion in downloads. Currently, the game is played by 238 million players players every month, which is an insane amount for the industry. It's the top grossing game in the App Store for 6 years in a row, and for a game that only had 2,000 levels on release, now has 15,000 of them. Also, the company was bought for almost $6 billion in 2015, so it's safe to say that Activision is quite happy with their investment so far. This all leads me to the present day, as usually the story ends there and we continue to look at another company being mismanaged, but now that Microsoft is in the picture, we know that changes are coming for the better. The one that I'm most excited for is the departure of the current CEO, Bobby Kotick. He accepted a $40 million exit payout, which means that he'll be leaving the company by the end of 2023. And now, I've been deliberating on how much I should actually cover this guy, because he's the most controversial man in the video game industry, period. Although after much deliberation, I decided it wouldn't be an honest and objective journalistic job if I gave him a free pass. So for that reason, I'm just gonna cover a few things real quick that he did in the last 2 years, or that he was involved in order so you get a global picture of why he's hated and why it's a good thing that he's leaving. He's basically the kind of person that gives himself a $20 million raise around the same time that he announces layoffs for the lack of profit in the company. He's protected individuals accused of rape and sexual allegations in the company by not pushing any legal actions on them while promoting them to decision-making positions. That tolerance nurtured a frat boy culture where high-ranking employees would drink, make sexual remarks, and invite female employees as they deemed, and I quote, hot. If you want more information on this subject matter, just go on the Google search bar and write the Cosby suit Activision. This actually escalated until an employee committed suicide last year during a business travel because she discovered that pictures of her in a vulnerable and, shall I say, suggestive state were being shared with the rest of the company present at the party. In other words, this is the kind of board of directors that don't value the prosperity of their employees. They don't care that employees are stealing breast milk from nursing mothers, for example, because those same employees are making the line go up. Don't believe me? Why else would they concentrate on releasing Call of Duties every year, regardless of the degrading lack of quality, public perception, and general burnout of the employees? You know what's even better? He even had an article made on him this year that downplays his involvement in everything, with the ultimate goal of smearing reality and making him look like the ideal leader. Now, I can't go on and on this, but my point is that now that Bobby is leaving and Microsoft will be taking control over the company, this will also bring the change that management really needs. With a bit of luck, it should bring better working conditions because as far as I'm aware, Microsoft doesn't have nearly as many issues as this one does. Although there is a silver lining here, and it's that Microsoft doesn't really manage companies as much as it prefers letting them prosper in their own way. They basically let their studios manage themselves and create the products that they want, which is awesome if you have a really determined and efficient team, that falls flat if it isn't the case. Only time will tell on what happens here, but I choose to believe that it will go for the better because, well, I honestly don't think it can get any lower than this, honestly. Although one thing that will definitely help smooth the transition into Microsoft's control is the conclusion of the court case that brought to light all the allegations that I basically mentioned previously. When that court case was filed by the California Civil Rights Department, it changed the way that we see the company and brought forth a plethora of issues that were kept hidden from the public. Now that it's closed and Activision settled on paying almost $55 million US, with close to $46 million of that amount going towards funds that helped those affected, it sort of ends the chapter for them and cleans the slate for Microsoft. All previous strings are no longer attached, and I think that it properly closes a dark chapter in their history. Not to mention that without that court case, Activision probably wouldn't have considered Microsoft's proposal. Microsoft offered to purchase them when they were at their lowest, both in the financial sense and in the moral sense as well. So all in all, I wish both Activision and Microsoft the best of luck in their endeavors. It's going to be a bumpy ride for sure, but at least they get to morally start from scratch, so I guess that's something, right? One other cool thing from the consumer standpoint that will inevitably come from this finalization of the acquisition will be the addition of their games into Game Pass. We've already had confirmation that we can expect something as early as 2024, so it'll be cool to see them port Activision's older and most forgotten games into Xbox's catalog. And who knows, maybe we can bring a resurgence for some of their dead franchises like, oh, I don't know, Prototype? For real. People, I want another Prototype, okay? I don't know if it's clear. I think I mentioned that game in like 3 of my videos so far. Like, that game just rules. Man. Dreams. Anyways, that's it for Activision, and honestly, I do hope that this brings the change that they do desperately need. Speaking of positive change, next on my list is a company that was very controversial at the time, but succeeded in putting itself back on track, and this year it was no exception.
Can't nobody out here do it like me. Ain't nobody out here winning like me. Can't nobody out here do it like me. Just like me, like me.
Capcom has had a really good year overall, with the remake of Resident Evil 4 selling 3 million copies in the first few days, and the last numbers provided by the company announced that it has sold 5 million copies in the first 5 months. Just to give you a more accurate idea on how those sales numbers are, the remake of Resident Evil 2 sold 5 million copies in its first year, and the remake of Resident Evil 3 sold almost 4 million in its first year. Resident Evil 4 made those numbers in 5 months, so it just shows you how relevant the franchise is, still after being conceived almost 27 years ago. The same sentiment goes for Street Fighter 6, which surpassed 2 million copies in its first month. And those numbers are also way higher than Street Fighter 5, who sold 1.4 million copies in its first 3 months. Really cool to see old licenses get the attention that they deserve, and Capcom certainly has gotten really good at treating their licenses properly. Same goes for the Mega Man Battle Network Legacy Collection, which sold 1 million copies in less than a month, and Monster Hunter Now, a mobile game that released in September 14, which collected $14 million in its first week, with 70% of it coming from Japan. The only game that's currently struggling is actually their newest IP called Exoprimal, which sold horribly from what I can tell. Anyone that follows the industry knows that companies love to play with numbers in order to make them look better than they actually really are. In this case, sales numbers were actually never released, but we did get an official response from Capcom stating that sales were challenging, but that the silver lining is that 1 million players are playing the game. That's rich coming from the fact that the game was day one on Game Pass, making it accessible to anyone with the membership. $2 million was made from the game, and 30,000 copies were sold on Steam, which is tiny if accurate. Although, it does make sense as reviews for the game were mixed in general, and the game wasn't really hyped before release, so I do understand that they'd rather let it slip between the cracks while they push their other games at the forefront. Fun fact, player numbers for Exoprimal on Steam are around the 200 to 300 mark, while Resident Evil 4 Remake brings in 4,000 to 5,000 daily players, which just shows you how good games can really push player interest. Also, Exoprimal is an online-only team-based multiplayer game, which means that it needs players in their lobbies in order to function, and those numbers aren't really healthy. No numbers were released from the Game Pass side of things, but I do hope that it's better, because I can't imagine Capcom wanting to keep supporting the game if it's this slow on all fronts. Lastly, they also announced that they're working on an update to their RE engine. For those that aren't aware, that engine powers most of their big hitters like Monster Hunter Rise and Resident Evil, which is essentially the reason they're upgrading it. The engine's having a hard time keeping up with demand because it's being used on different types of games all the time. That's why they're working on making an update of sorts that will keep all the attributes from the RE engine, but make it more accessible and accepting of future tech. Currently, they named it Codename Rex, and it seems that Dragon's Dogma 2 will be the first game that they make with the updated engine. CD Projekt Red is next, and they've mostly had an interesting year overall. They mostly spent the year fixing Cyberpunk 2077 and hyping fans on the upcoming DLC and the patch that brought a bunch of changes to the core game. Plus, with the success of the Netflix TV series that released last year, Cyberpunk ended up becoming popular once more. Just to give you more of a concrete idea, Cyberpunk since its release has sold more than 25 million copies, which outpaces The Witcher 3 surprisingly enough. To be more precise, Cyberpunk sold that amount in almost 3 years, compared to The Witcher 3 that did it in almost 4. Additionally, the DLC for Cyberpunk 2077, called Phantom Liberty, sold 3 million copies in a little more than a week, which is also really impressive. Although, the real story actually isn't about the sales themselves, but the cost related to making the products. It cost CD Projekt Red $174 million to make the base game, and another $142 million for marketing. The DLC cost almost half of what it cost to make the game, with a number that comes down to around $85 million. In total, it cost CD Projekt Red $402 million, and that number doesn't include the marketing cost of the DLC and the additional cost that fixing the game brought them, with the unofficial number being around $125 million. In other words, it cost them $500 million to fix, make, and create the DLC for Cyberpunk 2077. I can only imagine how much money this game would have brought if it actually released in a decent state, because these numbers are ludicrous. It's amazing. Lastly, I want to talk about CD Projekt's big plans for the future. At the time of making this video, they have 5 known projects in the works. First off, we have The Witcher, codename Polaris, which is currently in pre-production and is supposed to be the next main game in the franchise. It currently has a team of around 150 people, and it's being built on the Unreal Engine 5 rather than in the Red engine as previously. On top of them confirming the existence of The Witcher 4, they also confirmed that it's the beginning of an entirely new trilogy, which means that The Witcher 5 and 6 are also part of their plans. If that wasn't enough Witcher for you, they also have Projekt Sirius, which is supposed to be an online experience set in the Witcher universe, and they've also enlisted the help of outside studios in order to remake the original Witcher. In non-Witcher related news, Cyberpunk 2, codename Orion, has also been confirmed, and more interesting still, they're also working on a new IP called Adar. Personally, I think that's way too many projects for them at the same time. They typically work on 1 or 2 projects, but now having 5 is pretty hardcore. I just hope that they know what they're doing, because the company was mismanaged during the development of Cyberpunk. Even recently, the company laid off 9% of their staff, which amounted to around 100 devs. The good that came from this is that it prompted the remaining devs to create a union. Talks of unionization were happening around the end of the development time of Cyberpunk, as crunch had hit the development process and the teams felt like the management wasn't actually listening to their feedback. Now, we can only hope that this brings the change that the teams desires, as management will ask them to respect the deadlines that is set for all of these projects. EA is next, and man is it shitty. They started the year by firing 6% of their staff with the goal of prioritizing projects and cutting down office space. That amounts to around 740 laid off employees in a company that employs around 12,900 employees at the time. By the way, did I mention that they also recorded an increased amount of profits last year, which amounts to $6 billion in profit? What's also weird is that they laid off more than 200 playtesters from the Apex Legends games on mobile. You know what's the worst part? The employees found out about the layoff on an unscheduled Zoom call that happened at 8 a.m. in the morning. No one was warned about this decision beforehand, not even the full-time supervisors who were in charge of the teams. Although, they did provide a 60-day severance package, but that didn't cover the money that most individuals would have gotten if they finished their contract, so all in all, it's a really shitty move for EA. Also, the reason for the layoff was because EA decided to shut down the Apex Legends mobile game after only being out for like a year. Paradoxically, it seems that the game had a healthy amount of players, and it even won a few awards, like the iPhone Game of the Year in the 2022 Apple App Store Awards and Best Mobile Game of 2022 at the Google Play Awards. What's even more interesting is that we're not entirely sure why the game was shut down after only a year of service. From what I could find, it seems that EA was unsatisfied with the frequency and the quality of the updates and content drops that were delivered, and on top of all that, the in-game sales were also really low. This is actually an interesting one because on one hand, they lost 96% of its revenue in the span of 8 months, which is insane, until you actually look at the numbers and find out that they still made $37 million and that they also had 37 million users. If you compare it with the Call of Duty Mobile, it made similar numbers when it was released in 2019, so I honestly don't know. Maybe their projections were lower than planned and therefore decided to cut the project early, and as they were already thinking of downsizing, they basically seized the opportunity to get it done. From the consumer standpoint, it basically translates into them indeed making some money, just not all the money. One last thing before I move on. When Apex Mobile shut down, EA didn't offer any refunds for the in-game purchases, which also rubbed people the wrong way as they were led to believe that the game would exist for longer than a year, you know? Which just shows you once more how the live service model sucks no matter on what platform it's on. Moving on to other layoffs, BioWare also saw a handful of them. They lost 50 devs as part of their 6% cutback, which is sad for those that were excited for the new Dragon Age game. The layoffs also don't stop there. More than 200 employees worked on the customer service for FIFA lost their jobs as their plan was to close down the division and outsource the work to less expensive countries. Lastly, do you remember a game called Immortals of Avalum who reviewed okay and that didn't really sell even close to how much was expected to sell? Well, they actually had to let go half of their staff because of the poor sales of the game. Now, I want to paradoxically move away from all the layoffs that happened this year and talk about the financial stance of all of the people in charge. Did you know that the CEO of EA, Andrew Wilson, is getting a bonus package that sees him receiving a total of $20.7 million this year? Although, to be fair to the guy though, in 2021, his bonus was $39 million, and last year, it dropped to 19, so it's only fair that it's higher now that the company's expenses are slashed and profits went up. Also, in case you were curious, Chris Su, or I don't know how to pronounce it, I'm sorry, the chief financial officer for EA, got a bonus package that went up from $8.2 million to $9.1, and Laura Miele, the chief operating officer, went from $10.4 million to $10.8. Last year, EA actually had a really good financial year with $7.5 billion in net booking, which is a 21% increase year over year. There's also a 16% growth in player numbers with 580 million active accounts. FIFA Mobile had an 80% increase in new players year after year as well, which is just crazy. They also bought back some of their stock last year and upped the amount of the dividends on their remaining stock, so why they feel the need to downsize the company is honestly beyond me. Also, they declare a profit of $390 million in the second fiscal year 2023, so you decide for yourself why they decide to downsize as much as they did. Although, one theory that I have in mind is that they expected a drastic drop in sales because the games that were releasing this year could have been a hit or miss overall. Starting with the Dead Space remake, EA never released official sales numbers, which means that it didn't sell particularly well. That isn't surprising as all three main games never really ranked up huge sale numbers, although they did bring a lot of fame and sold well overall, which doesn't mean much for most huge companies, as the sales for the first week represent about 80% of its total revenue for the license. On the other hand, Dead Space did sell well enough that they made a poll asking fans if they wanted to see a remake of the other two main entries in the franchise, so that is something, I guess. Other than that, you have EA Sports PGA Tour, which made almost 1 million in its first month on Steam. Wild Hearts has sold almost 200,000 copies on Steam and accumulated almost $9 million in sales. That just shows you how much hype the game had before release and how much people were actually excited to play it. Unfortunately, the game suffered from crappy performance and some of its ideas didn't really work as intended, so most players ended up leaving for something else. At the time of writing, the game on Steam had a peak of 379 players, which is small for a live service game. By the way, Dead Space Remake on the same day had peaked at 1,639 players, so I find it funny that a single-player game currently has better stats in a company that stated years ago that single-player games were going extinct. Speaking of single-player games, Star Wars Jedi Survivor sold well, topping the sale charts for the month after just being out for 2 days. Although, again, EA never released any concrete sale figures, and the ones that we have are from the physical sales in the UK, which are becoming less relevant as sales move to digital. Also, to make the situation even weirder, EA stated that Jedi Fallen Order has sold more than 8 million copies after 2 months on the market, which was beyond their sales expectations, so them playing conservative for the sale figures for the sequel is weird to say the least. The last game that I want to talk about is probably the most interesting one in my opinion, and it's not because of the game itself, but the implication that it brings long term. EA Sports FC 2024 is the first soccer or football game, depending on where you're located in the world, made without the FIFA license. Basically, FIFA was asking for double of the previously agreed licensing fee, which would amount to $300 million in total. EA, questioning if they even needed the FIFA license in order to sell their games, decided to make a bold move and risk it. They ditched the license, created their own brand, and released the game. Did it pay off? Well, I actually think it did. It's complicated because there's a lot of conflicting information online. Overall, it does seem that it sold really well, and some outlets will make you believe that it sold even better than FIFA. Plus, EA also stated that the amount of players from FC 2024 was record-breaking for the franchise, while they also said the same thing for FIFA last year. My personal guess is that EA Sports FC 2024 is technically a new license, so this is, technically speaking, the first time that it appeared under that name, so again, technically speaking again, it is record-breaking considering that there were no previous records under that name. Also, if you compare the Steam charts, the stats are indeed similar, but FIFA 2023 did have a higher all-time peak, which fits with the reports that I mentioned previously. Although, don't forget that all EA games also appear on their own launcher and are multi-platform releases, so these numbers only really serve to portray the general health of the game. Now, I'm curious to know if they're actually going to renegotiate their other licenses now that they've proven that they can survive without FIFA. Who knows? Maybe we'll see a Madden or an NHL without the branding for once. Lastly, before I move on, I want to mention a rumor which probably isn't true, but is interesting as it could be the start to something bigger. Essentially, the rumor goes that Disney is looking to purchase a major gaming studio, and it seems that an offer was made to EA. Basically, Disney has been trying to enter the gaming sphere for a while now, and never really got the success that they wanted. I mean, they created Disney Infinity and then shut down the company a few years later, firing 300 devs in the process. Since then, they've mostly licensed their properties to third parties, with EA getting exclusive rights to Star Wars up until recently and more. It makes sense to me that Disney would want to buy themselves a ticket into the market as their own endeavors didn't really pay up, but to buy EA, not sure if they want to do that. So far, the talk started last year and nothing has really come out of it. I mention here because I do think there is one company in this whole list of companies that I'm going to cover today that might actually want to reconsider the offer and accept it, and it's actually Ubisoft. Even if they stated multiple times that they don't have any any intentions of selling the company until they literally said the opposite in private, with more on that later, I can see them reconsider if nothing gets fixed and stuff gets worse from here, but now it's not the time to really talk about that. Next on the list is actually the most elusive company in the whole industry. It's one that people that don't follow the industry haven't heard about, but have certainly played their games. It's also the same company that went on a buying spree until their lives depended on the deal that didn't go through and is now trying to prevent themselves from sinking in debt. If you've guessed the Embracer Group, you basically guessed right. It's a really interesting company because they aren't in the business of making games as there are in the typical sense of the word. They instead are in the business of acquiring studios and licenses in order to rank in the profits with what exists already. That's why most people have never heard of Embracer, but have either bought their games or have purchased some of their side video game related content. For example, they own THQ Nordic, Gearbox Entertainment, Saber Interactive, Crystal Dynamics, Eidos Montreal, Gunfire Games, Tripwire Interactive, and more. Plus, they aren't just in the video game industry, they also own the French board game publisher Asmodee, and even bigger still, Middle-earth Enterprises. Yes, they own the company that owns the licenses to anything related to the Tolkien universe. Additionally, they also recently bought Dark Horse Comics and Limited Run Games. What I find even more interesting is that the company was originally sprung up from THQ Nordic, and most acquisitions were made in the last 6 years. Now, when you go to their website, they state that they own 135 internal studios, own or control 925 licenses, and that their headcount is over 15,500 employees. Honestly, I'm really impressed and I have no idea how they're able to manage all of that, especially with the speed with which they're scaling their company. Although, that's probably one of the main factors as to why they had a rough year this year. Basically, they were really close to finalizing a $2 billion deal with Savvy Games, which is owned by the Saudi Arabian Sovereign Wealth Public Investment Fund. What I find most interesting in this whole story is that Savvy Group let them know that the deal wasn't going to go through on Tuesday night, literally a few hours before their earnings call the next day. Talk about a dick move, right? The deal crashing down forced the company to put a stop on their acquisition spree and restructure internally. In other words, they decided to fire 904 developers and shut down the year-old studio Campfire Cabal and the one that's closest to my heart, Volition. Yes, I know, the new Saints Row is horrible and that's why they closed the studio. It's just that I love the previous games in the series, so it's really sad that they had to disappear after the middling reception of Agents of Mayhem and now Saints Row. The next studio to hit the chopping block was the studio that was working on rebooting the Time Splitters franchise. The situation is so dire that they've even considered selling Gearbox Software, even if they acquired them only 2 years ago. Although, there's one thing that I find really interesting in all this, and it's that in their latest earnings call, which happened on November 16, 2023, they declared a 13% increase in revenue and a decrease of 31% in net debt. They stated their revenue gain was from the very lucrative licensing fees related to the collaboration between Lord of the Rings and Magic the Gathering and the sales of Remnant 2 and Dead Island 2 of all games. Actually, their tabletop division is going strong, getting a 15% growth, which they've expected to go even higher once their Star Wars card games come out. Although, the rest is underperforming, with PC console gaming being down by 5% and 17% at domestic growth. That's still attributed to the shitty release of Saints Row, as well as the lucratively poor launch of Payday 3. Plus, their mobile division also saw a decline in organic growth by 10%, but they expect it to even out by the end of the year. Basically, it peeves me that they're still doing pretty good, even if all the layoffs, but it's actually for that reason that companies invest in different markets. When one of them is in the lower revenue season, the other one might be lucrative, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. Plus, 904 devs fired is an awesome headline, but they still have 15,500 employees in total if you include those numbers. In the grand scheme of things, it's really only 5% decline in the staff, which is still impressive in its own way. Still, we can't forget that every single person in this list is someone that was forcibly placed in a tight financial situation because the company took for granted a lifeline that basically never happened. Remember, the people in charge of Embracer aren't the ones getting fired, it's the companies that, from a financial standpoint, weren't performing as desired, and therefore it's the staff that has to suffer the consequences as usual. Wait, what? You're gonna talk about Konami? Yeah, I know. I promised I was only gonna talk about the big companies in the industry, and Konami basically isn't even it. I mean, it's not even in the West at all. So why am I talking about Konami? Well, I actually did some research, and I think I have a valid reason as to why they basically popped out of the blue, and we're seeing so many games in the license. So do humor me at least for a bit, because I do think it's interesting. Contrary to what you might believe, Konami never actually stopped making games. They just abandoned the West and decided to concentrate on the Asian market. If you look at the earnings call that was released on March 31st, 2023, you can clearly see that most of their revenue actually came from what they dubbed the digital entertainment. It's a fancy category that basically contains all production, manufacturing, and digital content related to mobile games, card games, and computer video games. This year, they signed the mobile game Professional Baseball Spirits and Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel as their main hitters. By the way, Konami is the main manufacturer and distributor of anything Yu-Gi-Oh! Related, so if you've been collecting or playing their stuff, you've essentially been supporting Konami all this time. Knowledge is fun, right? Anyways, all other categories, as you can see on this chart, are way lower, with amusement being related to the manufacturing and licensing of their pachinko machines. The gaming and system is basically the same but overseas. Finally, they also own some minor sport-related businesses. The key thing to take from all these earnings is that their business has been stagnating. They're indeed seeing growth year over year, but it isn't growing fast enough to actually keep up with inflation and to bring substantial wealth back into the company. I think that's why they rebranded last year in July, and why they're licensing to anyone that they're willing to pay. I think that's also why they're releasing shitty products like Silent Hill Ascension, which is barely a game, let alone a Silent Hill game, and why we got a basic port of the first 3 Metal Gear Solid games. They just want the bottom line to go up, so far, they don't really seem to care how it is actually done. Still, I love Silent Hill, and I will keep my hopes up for Bloober Team's version of Silent Hill 2. In case you weren't aware, I actually made a retrospective on their first 2 horror games, being Layers of Fear and The Observer. If you're interested in hearing my opinion on them, as well as getting a productive way of killing an hour or two, then please support the channel. Speaking of prospering, next in line is actually Microsoft. So obviously, they bought Activision, which I don't need to repeat here, but it does bring an indirect but important question on the table. How does Microsoft actually make its money? You might be surprised to find out that gaming only represents 8 to 9% of its total revenue, and it's actually the 4th place in terms of importance when compared to their other services. If you look at the picture on screen, you'll see that their server products and cloud services represent almost 34% of their revenue. Office Suite license and its additional cloud service represents almost 23% of the revenue. And finally, Windows is at 12%. It just shows you how strong Windows and Microsoft Office are in the business sphere, when gaming represents around 9% of their total revenue, which amounts to $16.2 billion in 2022. Also, Microsoft revenue has been steadily growing as well, so they're pretty much golden when it comes to making money. Speaking of money, what I find equally interesting is that there are a lot of parallels that you can make between Game Pass and Windows itself. Let me elaborate on that just a bit. There are about 1.4 billion computers that either have Windows 10 or 11 installed on it. Do remember that most consumers didn't choose for Windows to be installed on their PC. It basically came pre-installed, which is awesome as less technical work is required from the start, but it also forces them to automatically be part of the ecosystem, which is why the numbers are so high. In other words, they ensured that most clients end up with a Windows device, which then creates the snowball effect. It makes it easy to sell them side products that are made for the platform that came with their device, while keeping them from trying the competitors' offerings like Apple, for example. Speaking of Apple, they stated that they had a total of 2 billion active devices this year. Note the word device on their marketing. This includes all their phones, tablets, MacBook, basically anything with an Apple OS. So it is very misleading, but sounds really cool if you don't think about it too much. The closest number that I found that states how many PCs were actually active was from an article written in 2017, stated that they had 100 million Mac users. They haven't really released any newer numbers, or to the very least, I couldn't find them. All that to show how integral Microsoft is to most consumers. They basically built an iOS that most people are happy using, and with time, created programs that attract the consumers in all other levels of complexity. That's essentially where Microsoft Office Suite comes in. The original version was actually announced in August 1988, so it's been around long enough that most people have basically used it. It's an all-in-one service that gets regular updates, grows with consumer feedback, and has something that can be used to solve any need, kind of like Game Pass. They sell their console at a loss, and still are, by the way, unlike Sony that went positive about 2 years ago. Although, that's not not an issue for Microsoft as they sell their membership dirt cheap in order to entice people in getting it. What's also cool is that Microsoft found a way to tap into that 1.4 billion market that I mentioned by making it also available on Windows without needing any additional peripherals. In other words, they decided to bypass the Xbox platform and sell you Game Pass, which is the Microsoft suit for gamers. Pay a monthly membership where games are being added all the time, which also includes new releases. Like, why would you buy Starfield on Steam, for example, and potentially lose $90 if you hate it when you can pay 12 Canadian dollars and get the basic membership and still get to try it on day one? Plus, with such a cheap offering, it creates positive word of mouth because everyone likes a good deal. From Microsoft's point of view, once the system is up and running, they just need to keep it functional, scale it as more people are added, and keep adding games to the roster, making it an efficient way to earn revenue while only requiring a minimum of maintenance. This seems to work because the last numbers that we got stated that there were 30 million subscribers on the platform. Although that number is unofficial as Xbox hasn't really confirmed it, but still, pretty impressive nonetheless. Also, and most importantly, Xbox makes 12% of all purchases made on their platform, including on Game Pass, which means that all loot boxes, DLCs, and game purchases bring them a lot of low-effort money. It's actually a really smart move and the main reason why console games don't really matter to them and why they don't really need first-party games. They can just buy the licensing fee of a game that they think will be popular and add it into the service. At the same time, it allows them to analyze their consumers and their trends in order to figure out where they should invest their efforts. Although, if we toss aside Microsoft's perspective and analyze the developer's position for a second, it's also good for them because they get a substantial amount of money sooner than they would have otherwise, while also having a bigger presence in the market. Fun fact, while we're talking about investments, they were intending to pay $200 million in order to get Star Wars Jedi Survivor on Game Pass, $250 million on either Mortal Kombat 1 or Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, and, more shocking of all, only $5 million on Baldur's Gate 3. Oops! Although in their defense, it seems that everyone underestimated Baldur's Gate 3 and their success even surprised the developers, so it's not something that's easy to predict sometimes. I know that I just spent who knows how long praising Game Pass, but for what it's worth, I want to switch gears a bit and talk about the negatives that may arise from such a service. Wait, are there actually negatives? Because I've basically seen a bunch of Reddit threads about people debating this exact concept and no one seems to really be able to come up with a consensus. It's for those reasons and more that I want to share my 2 cents on the matter because I do think there are a few indirect negatives related to such a service. First things first, it obviously damages physical sales. Game Pass is the antithesis to that kind of service as it's an all-inclusive digital service where all games are made available with one click of a button. Although, I get it. Why would you go to your local GameStop and buy a game when you can just pay a fixed fee and try as many games as you feel like trying? Well, this idea is actually the catalyst to my main point, which is the unavoidable question of ownership. What happens when you decide to revisit a game that you liked and is no longer available on the platform? Take Kazuha's Wrath for example. This game is what would happen if the Naruto series, Dragon Ball, and Buddha himself did hard drugs one evening and got one of them pregnant somehow. The game is basically about a demigod who tried to save his daughter from kidnappers and therefore used his anger to level up his strength and fuck shit up. You'll start the game by fighting beings bigger than you while evading their projectiles to finally becoming the size of a solar system, throwing planets, moons, and... yeah, it's just so intense that when I played it the first time, I basically finished it in one sitting and I bought straight the only story DLC because I didn't want the game to finish. And the same thing goes for my friends as well. Now this brings me to the main issue at hand, which is if I decide to play the game again for old time's sake, how can I actually make it happen when currently it's not available on any subscription service? Well, the answer is obviously emulation, right? But that's the thing. A lot of people, including myself, I've never really used emulation. Plus, to my knowledge, you can only emulate games on a PC, so what do you do if you don't have the will, the budget for a minimum spec PC, and the knowledge to make it happen? Plus, as we all upgrade to the newest Windows software, we also lose a lot of games that don't have the fan support to make it workable on the new iOS, so what do you do then? Well, that's the thing. You simply can't do anything about it. This also brings another issue at the table, which is that archiving video games is a joke at best. 87% of all video games since its inception are currently lost forever, so what do you do when the game that you want ends up being part of it? Basically, that's the void that physical games fill, and it's something that I feel is often neglected in the community. Of course, you can't talk about physical sales without mentioning the inflation price when buying from a reseller, but that's a totally different story for another time. I still think it's better than just not having the option, period. By the way, if you're interested in hearing more on this subject, there's an interesting video that was made with Christopher Nolan on exactly this subject. It's a promotional interview that he did for his Oppenheimer movie, where he talks about the importance of physical sales in the movie industry and how its disappearance will hinder movie production in the long term. If that interests you, I'll leave a link to that video in my video description. This also brings me to another point, which is less of a jab to Game Pass and more to one that applies to all subscription services. Basically, by paying your subscription, you want to mentally limit yourself in order to maximize your returns for your purchase. That basically means that you're limiting your options to whatever the company puts in front of you and are therefore less inclined to explore by yourself other avenues and try something that's not really within mainstream appeal. If we take that idea and stretch even further, what happens when Sony, EA, Ubisoft, Embracer, and the rest all want a piece of that Game Pass pie and decide to create their own subscription service? Will you actually pay $10 and more for each company? Plus, think about the effect that will have on the video game design if publishers knows that it's going to be a Game Pass exclusive game. I'm willing to bet that it will encourage them to make more time-consuming games that have more loot crates than what they currently have. Anyways, that's all I can basically think of on the matter, and I'm aware that most of it is actually speculative. The truth is that Game Pass has only been out since June 2017, which means that it's way too early to talk about the long-term effects that it will have on the industry as a whole. Plus, after all my research, I really couldn't find any current reasons why you shouldn't be part of it. The two closest reasons that I found was that having the game on Game Pass lowers consumer purchases of the game over time, although in return, the devs or publisher get a commission for putting the game on the service, and they also receive royalties for every person that plays the game, so it's a really sweet deal if you ask me. The other reason is that it damages the perceptive value of the game in the eyes of the consumer. The game on release is no longer worth $90 when it can basically be played immediately on Game Pass for even less. It's actually how I interpret the quote on screen, which states why Baldur's Gate 3 isn't coming to Game Pass. The important line is here: we made a big game, so I think there's a fair price to be paid for that, and I think that's okay. In other words, putting it on Game Pass wouldn't put it on the same level as other big AAA games on the market like Spider-Man, God of War, and more. It's definitely an interesting response overall, and one that I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on it. If you're a dev and you want to add on the matter, you can either leave a comment in the comment section of the video, or you can email me directly by going in the About section in my account and just sending me an email. Anyways, it's for those reasons and more that the consoles wars as we know it don't really exist, or to the very least, not the way that we imagine them traditionally. The playing field has changed a lot, and it seems that Microsoft was able to create a decent spot for itself, and that's good because its more concrete efforts haven't really been paying off. For starters, we have Redfall, which was disgraced on release and still is to this day. It brought minimal sales, and its current player count on Steam is actually in the double digits, which, again, is really low for a Bethesda game, let alone a live service one. Also, in case you were curious, these numbers are really similar to Bethesda's other online co-op game called Wolfenstein Youngblood. Although, in Redfall's case, the game was in development under ZeniMax until Microsoft took it under its wing way too far into development, so it's not technically their fault. Well, sort of, but that's a discussion for another time. Anyways, what I find even sadder is that Bethesda will keep supporting the game for a very long time. I played the game a few months back, and my verdict is that it has too many fundamental flaws keeping it from actually being good. Either they pull a Final Fantasy XIV and remove the game from the market to rework it, or they abandon ship and concentrate on something else. My vote is obviously an option too. Moving on, we have Microsoft's other big hitter, and the reason why they decided to buy Bethesda, Starfield. What I find intriguing about it is that Microsoft decided to be secretive about its sales figures. They've stated that it's the best-selling game of September, but they never provided any concrete sale numbers. The best that I can see is that the all-time peak for Starfield on Steam was 330,597 players, so the sales for the first week have been somewhat around that area, even if it's a stretch, which highlights a problem that we have in the industry at large. Very rarely are sale figures provided from companies. They usually only provide one when the game sells exceptionally well, which rarely happens for obvious reasons. Plus, now that games are going fully digital, it makes it even more complicated to figure out what the real numbers are. With physical sales, you can essentially keep track of them, which is why the UK sales are often cited as they keep a really good record, but with the digital market growing, those numbers are becoming rapidly irrelevant. To make matters even more complicated, companies like to play with the numbers around where they want to look better than what they actually are. Ubisoft is actually really strong in that front, and here's a concrete example just to give you a little glimpse of what's up ahead in my video. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is presumably the most commercially successful successful Assassin's Creed to date, but no sales figures were actually provided. The closest we got is with this post here, stating that the title surpassed 20 million players in February of last year, which doesn't mean much. Like, I can't compare this stat with other games of the franchise because they weren't actually made available. It's just one of those moments where it sounds really good on paper, but is irrelevant as no proof was provided, and there's also no way to compare that info with other games, let alone in the same franchise, as all other games use sales as the universal boasting figure. Back to Microsoft, I believe that in general, they aren't interested in providing sale numbers for their games and products. They stopped providing sale figures for their consoles, for example. Starfield also sold well, but nothing was provided. Game Pass is obviously really popular, but only unofficial numbers were given in recent years, and more. It sucks because it makes it really hard to concretely compare them with the rest of the industry, like Sony, for example. Although, to be fair, most consumers don't really care about sales figures, and it doesn't really change anything in the grand scheme of things. It's just that I find it really boring that they have a complete control on all numbers and don't feel like informing us. On the other hand, one thing that does affect most consumers is the state of the game and how it's received in the weeks following its release. Starfield is actually really interesting on that front. When the game was released, the reviews were actually really positive, but the more people stayed with it, the less positive people felt about it. The game is mostly negative on Steam, and players generally don't stick with it long term like for their other titles. Plus, the game was barely mentioned in the Game Awards, which is weird because you would expect it to be more commercially praised than it actually is. Moving on to other renowned Microsoft licenses, Forza Motorsports is also underperforming, and weirder still, no concrete news was actually given about Coalition for a very long time. Last news they gave us was that they were working on Gears 6 after 2 previous projects were cancelled. The only game that's actually doing well, or better if you want to be more accurate, is Halo Infinite. To be more precise, after the hype settled, they couldn't really keep up with the expectations that they set for the community, so a lot of the fanbase complained and ultimately moved on. Now with Forge finally in the game and Season 5 bringing changes that the fans wanted, it basically rejuvenated the game and brought back a lot of the people. It's also been retaining players, which is important for the long-term health of the project, so all in all, it's pretty cool to see some of the fame back, even if it's just a little. On a totally unrelated but still awesome note, Microsoft has been negotiating with the unions that have been representing the ZeniMax Workers Unit, and they both came to the agreement that 77 employees with contractor status would be bumped into full-time. That means that they're getting a salary increase of 22% and all the health benefits that it entails. The rest of the contractors will get a $2.75 hourly salary increase, as well as a paid sick leave, which is always nice to hear, especially in this volatile market. Lastly, I want to talk about the future of the company, as luckily for us and unluckily for them, some of their future plans have actually leaked. First of all, their newest console plans have leaked, and basically, it's a digital-only console with all the bells and whistles that you'd expect, like a stronger processor, better Wi-Fi reception, 4K gaming, and more. And all that for the low price of $500 US. On a side note, this is a trend that's becoming a reality faster than you actually might think. Remedy decided to only release Alan Wake 2 digitally in order to save some money. We've also seen a bigger influx of physical sales that come with an activation code and no physical inside. More importantly, Best Buy announced that they'll stop selling physical movies starting early 2024, although they did state that they'll still keep selling video games for a while, but the clock is certainly ticking, especially if future consoles are going to be digital only. It's only a matter of time before we no longer see physical games on sale, and that makes me really sad. You know, because I'm pretty much an old dinosaur at this point. Although one thing that can't come fast enough is Dishonored 4, baby! Couple of things that leaked are actually the games that are being made by Bethesda, like the remaster of Oblivion, a new Doom game codenamed Doom Year Zero, a Fallout 3 remaster, a sequel to Ghostwire Tokyo, and more. It also reconfirms the existence of the Indiana Jones game, which was originally scheduled for a 2022 release, and we've practically heard nothing since. Now, before I move on to Nintendo, I want to deviate a bit and mention 2 things that concern Microsoft but affect their business outside of the gaming sphere. The first thing is that they decided to start the year by downsizing and therefore removing 10,000 posts all over the company. All major tech companies have been having a rough time since COVID-19, and these layoffs are just part of those changes. Speaking of change, Microsoft is also investing a lot of money in the development of AI technology. Around the same time that they announced the layoffs, they've also invested $10 billion in ChatGPT and another disclosed amount to a startup AI company called Inflection AI. Unlike VR, where they're letting other people do the legwork, they strongly believe in AI technology and are placing themselves to be one of the main leaders in that sphere as well. One thing's for sure, and it's that AI technology is the new craze. Apple is currently investing millions every day in their language software Ajax, and Microsoft invested $4 billion in September 2023 on the startup company Anthropic, and the list just goes on. Only time will tell how influential Microsoft ends up being, as they like to fully immerse themselves in all new technologies and become the biggest pioneer in the market. I suspect that we'll hear more about the near future, so do stay tuned, as anything that they usually do has a butterfly effect on the rest of our lives. Nintendo, unlike all other companies on this list, is actually doing great, to the point that they're actually hiring staff and building a new facility in Tokyo, Japan. What's even more impressive is that they decided to slow down the construction of their new facility in order to rework the plans and make it able to sustain even more employees. Kinda crazy to think that Nintendo, who has been doing it his own way, is also the only one prospering in all aspects. Obviously, the success of the company wouldn't be the same if the Nintendo Switch didn't sell as well as it actually did. In September 2023, they announced that they have sold 132 million consoles, which makes it the second best-selling console of all time. Fun fact, that title actually goes to the PlayStation 2, which has around 157 million consoles sold, so the Switch really isn't that far off. Those numbers also mean that they have a huge fan base which are interested in their games, and Nintendo sure knows how to deliver. For starters, Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe Edition sold 1.46 million copies in its first month on the market. Actually, just for fun, here are all the sales figures for all Nintendo games during the physical year 2023. As you can see, Pokemon and Splatoon are actually really popular. You also have Zelda Breath of the Wild, which is still selling really well. To be more precise, it has sold 31.15 million copies since the release in March 2017. What's even more impressive is its sequel, Tears of the Kingdom, which sold 19.5 million copies since its release in May 2023. That's almost 2/3 of its predecessor's sales in a span of 4 months, which is crazy. Also, what I find even more ludicrous is that if you look at the bottom of the chart, you'll see that the Metroid Prime Remaster sold better than Bayonetta 3. Actually, everything sold better than Bayonetta 3, which just shows you how strong and their first-party IPs are, but also how niche the player base for Bayonetta is. I mean, it did sell a little more than 1 million copies in the span of a year, but that's still a lot lower than what I would expect. Although I did some more digging, and it seems that it took the second Bayonetta game more than 3 years to get to this similar amount in sales. Also, these numbers only represent the Switch sales, they don't include the Wii U, but from what I can tell, it didn't really sell that many copies on Wii U, as the Switch port outperformed itself when comparing the first 9 months of sales. Moving on, we also have Pikmin 4, which was released on July 21, 2023, and in a span of 2 months, sold 2.62 million copies. Honestly, I never really knew anyone that was into Pikmin, but it seems that it's really big in Japan, as more than half of its sales came from that country alone. Also, Pikmin 3, which was the best-selling Pikmin game at the time, sold 2.4 million copies on last declaration, which means that it's become the best-selling and fastest-selling Pikmin of all time. On the other side of the spectrum, we have Fire Emblem Engage, which sold 1.61 million copies. It's a solid figure, but actually lower than most of the games in this series in recent history. If you look at the list of games that were released in the last 11 years, it's the second worst selling game in the main series, with Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia being the worst of them all. Although, to be fair, if you add the spin-off games into the mix, its sales are actually better, but still. Also, Fire Emblem Three Houses is the best-selling Fire Emblem of all time, clocking it at around 4.12 million copies as of December 2022. It just shows you how unexploited the school mechanics are in modern video games. Hell, I've actually never played Fire Emblem before, and I still got Three Houses as my first Fire Emblem game because I really wanted a school simulator. Now I've kept the most important news for the end, which is obviously about the big hairy man himself, Mario. For starters, the Mario movie brought more than $1.3 billion at the box office, making it the best performing video game movie of all time. Although, its success had an even bigger effect on Nintendo, as they're using these numbers to motivate their investment in the theme park industry. They've already opened a theme park in Universal Studios in Hollywood, and are planning to open another one in the Orlando, Florida Universal Studio Park in 2025. Basically, the movie proved that the global population is still hungry for more Mario, and they've originally decided to branch out. Another way that we can see the fans are hungry for more actually comes from the fan speculation of what the next movies will be. A Luigi's Mansion movie idea immediately surfaced and hyped fans for the future, even if Nintendo never really added oil to the burning discussion. A lot of people also thought that Zelda would be next, next, and it got to the point that Nintendo had to shut down those claims, which just shows you how eager fans are of seeing what's next from the company. In the meantime, Nintendo is still in the business of selling video games, and their latest Mario game certainly benefited from the hype. Mario Wonders sold 4.3 million copies in just 2 weeks, making it the fastest selling Nintendo Bros game of all time. Although, there's also another reason that surely helped the sales of Mario Wonders, and it's the fact that it's the first game of the series where Mario and Luigi aren't voiced by the big man himself.
It's a me, Mario! Woohoo!
Charles-Andre Martinet has been voicing Mario and Luigi since 1994 and is now finally going into retirement, passing the torch on to Kevin Afghani. People were definitely curious to hear how the new Mario voice sounds, and pumped from the movie and the melancholy that came from his departure, the game ended up selling like crazy. Only time will tell if the sales are actually attributed to all the hype surrounding the license, or if all of the above actually broadened its reach, getting people who aren't usually into gaming interested in the license. One thing's for sure though, and it's that Nintendo hasn't been this strong in ages, and honestly, if the old console wars were still in and going, Sega would have nothing on them no matter what category you decide to compare them with. Sega is up next, and before we get in deep in the numbers, I want to talk about how Sega makes his money because I really wasn't aware before I started actively looking into it. First off, Sega's real name is actually Sega Sammy Group, and it's been this way since the merger between them and Sammy Corporation in 2004. They merged because they're essentially in the same line of business. Sega makes arcade machines and video games, and Sammy actually makes pachinko machines. Those two combined make up most of the revenue for the company. During the Q2 earnings call that ended up in March, they made 221.1 billion yen in revenue, with the rest going to the resort business and other minor offerings. Sega owns 2 resorts, with the first one being the Phoenix Seaguy Resort in Japan, and the second one being the Paradise City in South Korea. They're basically both super luxurious resorts with huge entertainment facilities, commercial facilities, huge casinos where they'll obviously find their pachinko machines, and more. What I find the most interesting is that if you look at the general sale charts on screen, you see 2 things that really stand out. The first one is that their revenue is back to the levels that they had pre-COVID, which is really nice to see, but the second thing is how much that revenue actually depends on the gaming industry. Even if it seems like they're doing really well, Sega would strongly disagree with that statement. They stated in the same earnings call that the sales for existing games were steady, but new games have actually been underperforming in general. Plus, the revenue from the manufacturing of physical goods is also down because the cost of materials have generally gone up and the value of the yen is still depreciated. Additionally, there's also another reason as to why the revenue is lower this year, and weirdly enough, I haven't actually seen anyone mention it. Sega decided to acquired a mobile company called Rovio. You might know them as the creators of Angry Birds and all its reiterations. Sega essentially bought all the shares that they could, which amounted to being 96.3% of the company. That acquisition also means that Sega had to restructure the European division in order to include them into their family. All combined, those are the reasons as to why Sega stated they had extreme losses this year. The good news is that the setback is only temporary, as once everything is in place with Rovio, they'll be able to rank in that Rovio money, which amounts to around 318 million euros last year. Plus, mobile gaming is huge in Asia, so getting an already known IP and adding their marketing team on it sure sounds like a winning recipe, or to the very least, that's probably what they're thinking on the matter. Now, I foreshadowed that they didn't make much from the new releases this year, and it's because they didn't release that many titles, and they generally didn't sell well enough for them to want to talk about concrete numbers. Sonic Superstars sold below expectations, citing Mario Wonders and Spider-Man 2 as the main reasons as to why it underperformed. Fun fact, Sonic Frontiers sold 3.5 million copies up until July 2023, and it actually sold less than the shitty Sonic Forces. However, the twist here is that more people bought Frontiers at a higher price, which means that it brought more money than its counterpart. It's also the reason why Sega stated that Frontiers is the best-selling 3D Sonic game of all time. Moving on to Persona Tactics, not much is actually known about the sales apart from the fact that it was the 5th in the sale charts in Japan. We also know that 50,000 copies were sold during the first week in Japan alone. Additionally, once the game hit Steam, it made $1 million in revenue, selling 220,000 copies worldwide. Here's actually the interesting part. Sega seems to play with the numbers a lot when talking about the success of their games. They've stated previously that Persona 5 series sold 9 million copies worldwide, making it the fastest selling entry in the entire franchise. Although if you look closer, you will see that they got the number from grouping the sales of Persona 5, Persona 5 Royale, Persona 5 Royale Remaster, Persona 5 Dancing in Starlight, and finally, Persona 5 Strikers. I don't know any other company that does this or to this extent, which is another example of how companies like to play with the numbers in order to hide the truth, which is that every Persona game in the Persona 5 series sold less and less the more the titles went. Sounds less impressive when stating that Persona 5 Strikers sold half of the copies of the original Persona 5 sold, but grouping them all together really helps paint a more colorful picture. The other reason why I think that they're doing it this way is because their sales figures can't actually compete with the ones provided by their competitors. I mean, like I stated previously, Mario Wonders sold 4.3 million copies in just 2 weeks, which is almost half of what the whole Persona 5 series sold since its inception. This juggling with numbers is also a tactic used by the Yakuza series. They never really stated how many copies each game in the series sold, but instead opted to give us a combined number. The Yakuza series, all combined until October 2022, has sold 19.8 million copies. Dissecting that number, the closest that I found to give us a more digestible number would be this article here that classifies them by most sold since its release. As of November 2021, Yakuza 0 is the best-selling game with around 2 million copies. Yakuza 1 Kiwami also sold around 1.5 million copies, and Yakuza Kiwami 2 sold a little less with 1.3 million copies. Here's another puzzler. The closest number that I found that would tell us the sales of Yakuza Like a Dragon is actually this one here, which combines the sales of that game, Like a Dragon Ishin, but also both Judgment games, bringing us a total of 510,000 copies. Lastly, the newest Yakuza released not too long ago, called Like a Dragon, The Man Who Erased His Name, and no proper sale figures have actually been released. All we know is that it was the second best-selling game in Japan on the week of its release if you combine both the PS4 and the PS5 sales. Also, in case you were wondering, its sales were outshined by Mario Wonders on its 5th week on the market, which is quite sad because the Yakuza series is definitely underappreciated in my opinion. If you do get the chance to play them, I would recommend that you start with Kiwami 1 and then you can move on from there. I think they were also added in Game Pass recently, so if you want a really efficient way of playing them, that could also be an option. Now I want to talk about the even sadder news that I have on Sega, starting off with the cancellation of a game called Hyenas. It was supposed to be a live service extraction game, kind of like the Payday series, but instead of robbing banks, you're stealing high-valued items, with some of them originating from known video game franchises. What's also interesting is that Hyenas had the biggest ever budget from Sega, but no amounts were actually disclosed. The closest that reporters have gone to figure it out is that Shenmue 1999's budget was 70 million, so Hyenas to the very least cost more than that, with rumors being in 100 million. The reason for its cancellations are as follows. One anonymous tip stated that the game was mismanaged throughout most of it and lacked a general sense of vision. They also had an engine change partway through the process, and finally, the game was about to release in a very competitive and saturated market. All of that combined with the reason that Sega made public, which is that they currently have a low profitability in the European region as the company is based in England, and you can easily imagine what happened next behind closed doors. Sega lost confidence in the project, looked at its long-term projections, both in player counts and maintaining the game's servers, and finally decided to pull the plug. Plus, with them wanting to cut losses because of the merger with Rovio, it makes sense that they would rather lose the money invested so far than pay for marketing and long-term maintenance on a product that isn't up to code. By the way, the game was supposed to release in 2023, which means that it was practically ready for release. Now, the company faces layoffs, and combined with the other issues that it's facing, like an ongoing investigation related to employee mistreatment and the backlash from fans that feel ripped off at the way that Creative Assembly have been treating their other licenses, and it's really hard to see if there's actually a future for Creative Assembly. Layoffs are also hitting Relic Entertainment, which has lost 121 employees in May, which amounts to 33% of its total staff. The reason for the layoffs are what you'd expect, with multiple delays on projects, rising costs on practically everything, with inflation still hitting Canada pretty hard, and more. One last thing before we move on to Sony, Sega of America is being accused of threatening to lay off its contractor staff if union talks persist. Sega is essentially another company where the majority of its employees agreed to get unionized, and during the negotiation process, Sega of America decided to use around 80 posts as leverage. Only time will tell what happens on this front, as it's an ongoing situation, so again, please keep an eye on it, as whatever ends up happening will inevitably affect its devs and the quality of their work. Prospering devs make games that, in turn, please the players, so I wish those devs the best of luck in their endeavors. Sony makes its money in 4 ways. On top of being a solid contender in the video game industry, they also make a lot of money with their music sales, movie productions, and finally, from the sales of their home appliances. Let's start with the one that actually brought you to this video. The PS5 console has obviously sold more than the Xbox Series X, but what might surprise you is that the PS5 isn't outselling its predecessor. If you look at the 2 charts on screen, which I found on VGC charts, you'll see that the PS4, which is represented by the orange line, has mostly outsold the PS5 during the same time period. The PS5 sold 38.45 million copies in its first 31 months, unlike the PS4, which was at 40.25 million copies. As a quick recap, Sony was one of the companies that was hit hard by the chip shortage that started in 2020, which in turn made it almost impossible for most consumers to get access to the console. Now that the issue has been resolved, they promised to ramp up production in order to make it constantly available to consumers, which in turn will rank up more sales in the long term. In September, Sony stated that they had sold a total of 46.6 million copies, which is definitely an impressive number, especially when compared with Xbox, which is only at almost 24 million. Although, as stated before, Xbox doesn't really care about its console sales, unlike Sony, which doesn't have a strong presence in the PC market. Fun fact, the PS5 hasn't been selling at a loss since 2021, unlike Xbox, which, last time they talked about it, which was in 2022, was still losing between $100 and $200 per unit. Also, this somewhat touches another issue which is related to the leaks that happened with Insomniac Games. For those that aren't aware, a group of hackers infiltrated their software and stole a little more than 1.67 terabytes of data. They demanded $2 million from Sony, or from anyone that was actually willing to buy the data, and once no one actually flipped the bill, they released 98% of it directly to the digital darknet. That's 1.3 million files that were deemed highly classified by the company because they were either containing the employee's private information, like an email, phone number, physical address, bank accounts, and more, or it had Sony's plans for the future, like the allocated budget for upcoming games, some concept art, digital story pitches, and more for their unannounced games supposedly releasing in the next 12 years. There's obviously more that got released, but my point is that I'm not gonna go through the whole thing in detail because it wouldn't be fair to the other companies on this list. I barely covered future releases so far, so covering them for the sake of covering a leak wouldn't be professional in my opinion. Also, unlike the other stuff, like the leak for example from Microsoft, which was self-inflicted with minimal damage done to its own company, here is a leak caused by theft of information that was released as the ransom wasn't wired to the group. It's because of that malicious intent that I feel reluctant to even mention it, let alone cover it, and it's for those reasons and more that I think that it's not my place to actually cover it in this video. Although for the sake of journalistic transparency, if you want a more concrete description of what was leaked, you may type Insomniac Hack 2023 on Google search bar and you'll find a bunch of articles on the subject. That being said, the one that I actually want to cover, which is related to my previous statement, is the part where Sony talks about their position in the market in regards to Microsoft. Basically, they stated that Microsoft acquiring Activision is a huge problem for them in the long run, and it can cost them a lot of PlayStation Plus subscribers. They recognize the strength that Xbox has with Game Pass, and by putting Call of Duty on it, they can easily see Microsoft leapfrogging over them, and that's the term that they actually specifically use in the forum. By providing a strong service in both the console and PC market, as well as having an equally strong presence on the mobile platform, they're essentially able to somewhat ignore their progress and create a strong presence in more markets than Sony. All that to say that they acknowledge that their current success model is ultimately outdated. Don't get me wrong though, it's still working really well for them, and I'll be touching on those aspects in the rest of my video, but the point is that they don't see a long-term future in just releasing strong exclusives on their own console. It's with that mindset that we're then able to properly understand why Sony has started re-releasing their games on Steam, and why they bought Bungie, and why they're currently working on 12 live service games. Although, that's also where the current problems lie, as half of those games were pushed back. The Last of Us 2 multiplayer was cancelled after 10 years of production, and Bungie's actually not doing so well, and more on that later. Quick side note, if you read the update that announced the cancellation of The Last of Us multiplayer, they stated that after working on it for so long, and the project finally growing in a proper direction, they ended up with an interesting choice on their hands. Do pay attention to the language used here, because I do think that what's underlined is a lot more important than what's actually said. In wrapping up full production, the massive scope of our ambitions became clear. To release and support The Last of Us multiplayer, we'd have to put all our studio resources behind supporting post-launch content for years to come, severely impacting development on future single-player games. So, we had two paths in front of us: become a solely live service game studio, or continue to focus on single-player narrative games that have defined Naughty Dog's heritage. Let's start with the top. The multiplayer started production in 2014, so why did it take them 10 years before they realized that this would be too demanding for the studio to handle? Management must have been aware of the strain that it would cause on the studio, either by looking at their competitors or by looking at their cost calculations, so why decide that now is the time to stop and move on? Is it because the CEO is leaving and therefore some execs are doing some pushback? It's hard to say, but one thing's for sure, and it's that the person that wrote the post certainly had a negative view on the live service model, which is rare to find as most PR speeches are dry and emotionless. Regardless of how you feel on both types of games and on the cancellation of this project, Sony thinks that their future lies in those live service horizons, so one can only hope that they cracked the code for success as they did for the single-player genre, because there are too many bad propositions out there, and Sony has worked long and hard to earn the reputation that it has. Back to the hardware side of things, Sony also released their new PlayStation VR headset, and the sales are meh. Like, it's selling better than the original headset in the same time frame, but it's really nothing to write home about. It's probably the reason why they haven't released any sales numbers since then, and why they aren't pushing more efforts into supporting it. Don't get me wrong, they're still making games for it, but with barely any first-party games on the system, and the PS4 games not really being compatible, it seems to be like they want other third-party companies to build the gaming library. Lastly, they also released the PlayStation Portal Remote Player, which is a handheld console that lets you play your PS5 through your Wi-Fi internet. Basically, it's not a real handheld console. You can't play your game outside like with a Nintendo Switch or the Steam Deck. It's basically made for people who want to play their games but either can't use the TV for some reason or want to change rooms and can't move the console. It's perfect for one of those long ones that really make you sweat.
You gotta love the ones that make you sweat.
Honestly, this could have been so much bigger than it actually is. I mean, wouldn't more people buy this console if they were able to stream their games on the go? I don't see how this product can be worth their investment, but whatever. By the way, no sales figures were released as well, but one thing's for sure, and it's that the console, or whatever it is, sold out in most stores because scalpers decided to resell it at almost double the price. Moving on to gaming, the only first-party game that they released this year was Marvel's Spider-Man 2, which sold 5 million copies in its first 11 days, which is really impressive. It also sold more than 2.5 million copies in its first 24 hours, which actually puts it ahead of God of War Ragnarok. Fun fact, the first Spider-Man sold 13.2 million copies as of August 2019. Since then, PlayStation has sold another 20 million when combining the original version, the remastered edition on PS5, and Miles Morales, which all combined amounts to 33 million sales. Those are honestly some really impressive numbers, and that kind of high performance is representative of all their games. God of War 2018 sold 23 million copies worldwide as of November 2022. Ragnarok sold 11 million copies in its first 3 months. It also sold 5.1 million copies in its first week, which made it the fastest selling PlayStation game until Spider-Man 2 hit the market. Horizon Zero Dawn sold 20 million copies in the 5 years that it's been out. Also, Horizon Zero Dawn sold 7.6 million copies in the first year, which is lower than Forbidden West's 8.4 million copies. Although the interesting thing is that when comparing the game to all other major PlayStation releases, the Horizon license is underperforming all of them. There are multiple reasons for this, with the first one being that Horizon is a newer license, it therefore doesn't have the long-term fan investment that most of their other games have at this point. Although, that's far from being the only reason, as when the second game was released last year, it was overshadowed by Elden Ring, which in turn surrounded the game with negative press. Basically, gamers played Elden Ring and then looked at Horizon Forbidden West, finding its world and quest design lacking and uninspiring in every way. Plus, to make matters even worse, some of the devs reacted poorly to all the commotion, permanently tainting the game's reputation in the eyes of players. Since then, the game has been overshadowed by all other releases, so most people just forgot about it and Sony actually barely mentioned it. The other disappointment in Sony's library this year also comes from the lack of consistency and quality of Bungie in regards of Destiny 2. Anyone that's been following the game from some distance has heard of the fan outcry that surrounds this license, so I won't really go too much into detail. I just saw that the last season that released for Destiny, called Nightfall, was generally hated by the community, and most felt that it really wasn't pushing the story in a proper ending, and the content on offer was very bare bones and not as rich as The Witch Queen, for example. Plus, the game is riddled with microtransactions to the point that people are starting to feel ripped off. It was also announced that Bungie has been simultaneously working on another game called Marathon, and that was also rubbing people the wrong way, as they feel like they're reinvesting their efforts and money from Bungie into this new project. Now, it seems that the situation has gotten a lot worse because the company had to put in some drastic cost-cutting protocols, which, in other words, means that they'll have to lay off 100 out of 1,200 devs while pushing back Marathon and the final DLC for Destiny. Those dev layoffs also came with their own controversy because, on top of feeling unfair, Bungie decided to let go the main music composer of the game, who's been with the company for more than 25 years. That one especially hit hard fans because it shows that there's no job security in the company, and his music was generally loved by the community. It made the game for some fans, so seeing him go indirectly announced the end of an era. Although, it might indeed be the case, as newer reports state that the general morale of the company is horrible, and talks have leaked that Bungie might not stay as independent from Sony for as long as they had first hoped. In case you weren't aware, Sony bought Bungie for $3.6 billion US, but even so, Bungie would still be an independent entity. They would essentially benefit from Sony's connections and would answer to them directly, but would retain the Destiny IP and would still function as a separate company. Now that talks of the general merger has started, it's only a matter of time before we find out what happens because, basically, it can't stay the way that it was. Bungie isn't making enough money and fans are fed up with the current state of the game, so a decision needs to be made sooner rather than later. Now, before we move on, I want to leave the gaming sphere and rapidly touch on the three other revenue spheres of the company. First off, the Sony Music Group, which englobes a lot of different companies, notably Sony Music Entertainment and Sony Music Publishing, had a 14% increased jump in revenue. For the quarter that ended up in September 30th, they stated that the revenue is up 13.7% year after year. The adjusted operating income is also up by 10.9%, and their recorded music revenue is also up by 13.3%. Overall, everything from their increased music recording, music publishing, and music licensing for what they call visual media and platform is also up. Those include licensing music for mobile games and animation projects, although the last one was omitted from the revenue counter in the earnings quarter, but from what I can tell, that part is also up. Additionally, the income from their subscription streaming services as well as the ad revenue on those same platforms is also up by 12%. The only metric that seems to be down in this quarter is the revenue made from physical sales, which is down by 7.8%. Not a surprise as a decline of physical sales is hitting all markets. I suspect that, like the gaming industry, the number will keep going down and the music streaming revenue will exponentially go up. One that's not going to go up anytime soon is the revenue for their movies. The revenue saw a 45% decrease because Sony didn't have any major blockbusters releasing this year. This year's releases are Gran Turismo movie, The Equalizer, and Insidious Red Door, and you can see why you can't compete with the terms of consumer interest when the movies who actually brought in the most money in the previous years was like Spider-Man No Way Home and Venom Let There Be Carnage. Add in the lower revenue from the television division and the Hollywood strike, and it's easy to see that interest for their offerings has been dwindling in general. On the other hand, Sony Pictures saw an increased profit of 1%. It also saw an increase of 13.4% in sales and an operating income increased by 77%. Although, one thing you need to keep in mind is that Sony also makes its money from the production of physical products like televisions, cameras, consoles, and more. Essentially, that section of their market is the only part in which they're really underperforming. With the rise of cost and the depreciation of the yen, it costs them more to build the same products, and it's that margin that's drastically eating their revenue. Plus, the competition is fierce to the point that some believe that they should actually let go of that part of the market and concentrate on their insurance offerings. It seems that in Japan, they make a lot of money from writing life, car, and medical policies, and that area of revenue amounts to 63% of the total operating profits last year. That being said, Sony letting go of its position in the production of physical products is very slim because they're really proud of their origins. Sony actually started off as an electronic company that made radios, Walkmans, and more. They were also the company that built the first tape recorder called the Type G. From there, they basically grew and ballooned into the leading producer we know today as the second biggest camera production company, who also has 55% of the market share in image sensors. Only time will tell what they decide to do, but for now, as the rest is generally performing with some minor exceptions, they at least have a lot of leverage to try new things while adapting to the final result. Square Enix is generally in a bad financial situation. Since the launch of Final Fantasy XVI, they've lost $2 billion in revenue, which is the result of all their missteps in the last few years. Just as a quick recap, after the financial struggles that they had with the games being made in North America, they decided to sell Eidos Interactive, Crystal Dynamics, and Square Enix Montreal, which also included their intellectual properties like Tomb Raider, Deus Ex, Thief, and The Legacy of Kain. They made $300 million from that sale, which is ludicrously low in my opinion, and then decided to reinvest that amount into creating games that will be part of the blockchain. Basically, they decided to double down on NFTs and cryptocurrency, which is extremely controversial in the gaming industry, and that's the whole polite way of putting it. Then, they released a game that fans thought it was a remake of Parasite Eve, which ended up being a non-related NFT game. Fans feel like the company isn't investing its efforts in the right places while trying to squeeze out as much money as possible. That sentiment is also identical to how people feel about their most controversial game of last year, which is Marvel's Avengers. I'm not gonna go too much into it as there's enough hate on the internet on this game, but just know that the game sold 60% of what Square Enix expected and therefore had a projection loss of $67 million US. That's also another reason why people are pissed at Square Enix for selling the company. Fans feel that they forced the developers to make a subpar live service title, and once the game bombed, they essentially cut ship and moved on to the next money scheme. A similar story happened with Forspoken bombed on release. It cost around $100 million to make, or to the very least, that's what the lead writer wrote on their LinkedIn if accurate. Then, on release, it reviewed poorly, became the laughingstock of the industry, and then they decided to merge the company, essentially killing off the studio, but shredding the devs where they're needed in the company. This all leads me to Final Fantasy XVI. It was supposed to be the one that saves the company from its downward trend, and in a way, it did exactly that. It sold 3 million copies in its first week, which is a strong start, but unfortunately, it seems that the sales slowed down drastically from there. No additional sale figures have been provided since, and I think that there are two factors that can actually explain why Final Fantasy XVI has been underperforming in general. First of all, Final Fantasy XVI wasn't a multi-platform release. It's not available on Steam, Epic, Xbox, or anywhere else for that matter. It was and still is an exclusive to the PS5, which means that they're starting off with a really limited clientele base. There are currently 46.6 million users, which is a high number, but nothing compared to how big it would have been if the game was released on Steam as well. Just to give you an idea, 25,274 people played Final Fantasy XIV in the 24 hours that this script was written. In other words, there's a huge dedicated player base on Steam, and if it was also available there on day one, I'm sure that the story would have been quite different. The second reason that the sales are low is that the game ended up being quite controversial. They made a lot of changes to the general feel of the game, so when the news spread that it wasn't what some had expected, it certainly discouraged a lot of fans from getting it. At the end of the day, if you wanted more concrete proof that Final Fantasy XVI didn't live up to Square Enix's expectations, we got confirmation that the game won't receive any spin-offs or a sequel of any kind. The director is essentially moving on to other projects, and the team is being disbanded, with the exception of the main team that's working on the DLC for the game. Even if I personally didn't like the game, I can with full confidence state that the team didn't deserve this ending. The game had a lot of talent behind it, with a team that had the years of experience required to execute on it. I think that the real problem here is the environment that it was released, because I think that Square really needed a win, and anything less wouldn't have actually made the cut, which is why it ended up this way. Quick change of subject before I move on to Ubisoft. I want to talk about a quick court case that was finalized this year. Of course, I'm talking about Yuji Naka, the guy credited as the creator of Sonic. Essentially, he moved to Square Enix in 2018 and made the infamous Balan Wonderland. Then, a little after its release, he was arrested on the charges of buying 10,000 shares of the developer called Aiming just before the public announcement of their mobile game called Dragon Quest TAC. In other words, he was accused of insider trading. Plus, 2 weeks after release, he was accused of insider trading again for buying 144.7 million yen of shares from the developer working on Final Fantasy VII, The First Soldier. The second charge happened in December of last year, so this year, we finally got the situation resolved. In March, he admitted that he was indeed guilty of the charges, and in July, he got his final verdict. He got 2.5 years of prison with an additional 4 years of probation. Additionally, he also needs to forfeit 171 million yen and pay a fine of 2 million yen. That's basically where it stands now, and I wanted to mention it because I think it's an interesting story. He made Sonic and then was somewhat irrelevant depending on who you ask, but one thing's for sure, and is that he came back in a huge way with Balan Wonderland. Then, once the hate dropped and people started moving on, he's then accused of all this? It's quite sad that his legacy had to get to this, but that's just how life is, right? In a way, Square Enix's story and his are quite similar. Both are living off their old fame, and their downfall is led by their search for money. Only time will tell what happens to both, and I genuinely wish the best of luck to both of them, because I think that they're genuinely gonna need it. Ubisoft, oh man, where do I start? Well, it's really easy to hate this company, and honestly, I do riot against them quite a lot, but for once, I want to change my ways and start with what they're doing right, because there are a few things that are definitely worth mentioning. For starters, this has been one of their best years in a very long time. All revenue spheres are up compared to the prior years, to the point that it mostly exceeds expectations. The Crew Motorsports, for example, has had its best week of sales in the whole franchise's history. They haven't provided any sale numbers, and as I foreshadowed previously, this is a pattern with them. Actually, all games mentioned in this section do not have any sale figures of any kind, but do come with some really fun quotes, like in this example here, where they stated that its total units sold beats the other two games in the series. Plus, the adoption rate of the season pass and overall consumer spending is also higher than both previous titles. By the way, I didn't choose the words adoption rate. They're the official combination of words used to qualify the act of spending 50 Canadian dollars plus tax on something that actually isn't even out yet. Still, that's awesome news for a series that started off very controversial and with the second game not really selling that well. To be more precise, I couldn't find any official sales numbers for The Crew 2, but the closest that I found is this post here that states that both The Crew 1 and 2 up until February 2023 brought in 40 million players. Now, 40 million sounds impressive, but it actually isn't because 1, it's not the current player counts, it's all platforms combined since 2014 when The Crew 1 released. Also, the first game was given for free on multiple occasions to anyone with a subscription to the Xbox or PlayStation. It's also easy to get access to a cheap physical copy of both games nowadays, and that's if you don't mind playing the game alone, as barely anyone is playing it on Steam, so I can't imagine how different it must be on consoles. Plus, the first game was overhyped before release, so I can imagine that a lot of people got it then and basically never went back to it, as was the fashion around this time period, with similar story happening with Watch Dogs 1 and Assassin's Creed Unity. Then, The Crew 2 magically appeared with barely any marketing, and I know no one except myself that actually played it. Currently on Steam, it sits around 600 players in the last 24 hours, which is really low for this kind of game. Just to give you a bit of a comparison, Forza Horizon 4 released at the same year as The Crew 2, and its Steam charts are exponentially higher with every metric available. Although yes, I do get that comparing the second game of a series with one that exists in 2005 isn't completely adequate, but I couldn't really think of any better comparison, and I found the information interesting nonetheless. Long story short, Ubisoft likes playing with numbers, and sometimes you can easily catch them in the juggling act, which is clearly what's happening here. Moving on, Rainbow Six Siege has proven very popular this year with the release of its Year 8 Season 3 content. It got a 50% increase in net booking in just the first half of the year, which is an amazing growth for a game that started off as a failure. Currently, it has almost 50,000 players just on Steam, and with it being a multi-platform release, those numbers must be exponentially higher. Now you know why every Ubisoft presentation spends like a third of its runtime just on Rainbow Six Siege. One last thing before I move on, I had almost forgotten about this, but there's actually a Rainbow Six Siege movie in the works. Also, when I say that it's in the works, I mean that it's on the table, but nothing concrete is actually done on that front. Basically, the same director that's working on the Ghost of Tsushima movie also wants to make a movie of the game starring Michael B. Jordan, but development issues mixed in with the writer's strike really put a stop to it. Anyways, its other big hitter this year is actually Assassin's Creed Mirage. Obviously, no sale figures once more, but as always, they've provided an interesting quote. Ubisoft states that Mirage was the biggest launch when only considering PS5 and Xbox Series X and S sales. That indirectly means that if you consider all other platforms that the game has released on, like the PS4, the Xbox One, Microsoft Windows, and Amazon Luna, it's not actually their biggest release in recent history. The closest general idea that I could find on its sales comes from GamesIndustry.biz, which states that Mirage's first 4 weeks on the market are over 49% lower than what Assassin's Creed Valhalla managed. Compared with older Assassin's Creed games, Mirage's sales are 22% higher than 2018's Odyssey and 6% higher than 2017's Assassin's Creed Origins. They note that these stats are solely based on the sales in the European market and excludes all other countries and markets, so see it more like a general trend than actual hard facts. Overall, Assassin's Creed Valhalla still holds a spot for the best grossing game of the franchise, but as Mirage is a smaller scope and budget, it seems to have performed well enough for Ubisoft to celebrate with another juggling of the numbers. Well, at the same time, they sort of have to, because they previously stated that they're going all in Assassin's Creed. They've stated that they'll expand the teams that are working on various Assassin's Creed projects by around 40% in the coming years. Plus, on top of releasing a second game in the franchise this year called Assassin's Creed Nexus VR, they're also working on 4 more games, a Netflix TV show, and a mobile game for Netflix's mobile gaming platform. I just hope that they know what they're doing, because a lot of people, including myself, are experiencing license fatigue, so hopefully they'll be able to make a more quality product that rejuvenates the license like Mirage did. Well, sort of. Their perception of the game is pretty mixed mixed overall, with some stating that it doesn't really bring anything new on the table, while the more favorable reviews state that it went back to its roots just enough to feel like the old days. More broadly speaking, this melancholic response is exactly how all Ubisoft games that we've received in the last few years, and over time have become symbolic of the company. In a little more than a year, they've cancelled 7 projects because, as the CEO Yves Guillemot states, the company was stressed out and working on too many projects simultaneously. The main problem, other than the fact that these kinds of things don't happen unless the company is mismanaged, is that it shows that they don't have a set long-term plan for their IPs. Among those cancelled games was the Splinter Cell VR title. Surprisingly, Splinter Cell was one of those many franchises that became irrelevant because of their lack of vision. The last game in the franchise came out in 2013, and nothing concrete came out of it since. Add to the mix projects like Beyond Good and Evil 2, that God knows what the fuck's happening with that one. The Prince of Persia remake, which was supposed to release 3 years ago but fell in development hell and still doesn't have a release date. And finally, who could forget Skull and Bones, that started off as the DLC for Assassin's Creed Black Flag, bloated into a full game that was announced in 2017 and has since rivaled its creator in the controversial department. Its new set release date is February 16th, which is interesting for 2 reasons. The first one is that February is packed with anticipated games, and when I say packed, I mean packed like crazy. Here's a list of games releasing that month, with some of the highlights being The Banisher, Ghosts of New Eden, Mario vs. Donkey Kong, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and the controversial Suicide Squad. Basically, the game is going to be buried, and I think that's the plan. People will be too busy talking about other games that only the most dedicated people would choose Skull and Bones. Everyone thinks that this game will burn on release, and if you want to know why, just write Skull and Bone controversy on Google. The other reason why the release date is interesting is because they placed their Prince of Persia spin-off in January during a period where very few games are releasing. Plus, releasing at a lower cost means that more people are going to try it, which conveniently means that they'll be able to bury Skull and Bones by boasting about the success of Prince of Persia. Also, some people have already tried it, and it seems that it's a really fun game overall, so chances are pretty good that it's gonna get a good press on release. Lastly, if those first impressions are wrong and both fail for some reason, they can always blame their fierce competition as the source of their loss, while reminding investors that 2023 was a really good year for them. All that to say that no one will be talking about the core issues plaguing the studio, which was generally mismanagement mixed with multiple sexual allegations that have lasted for the last 3 years as far as the public is concerned. Just put you up to speed, Ubisoft made a deal with the authorities in Singapore. They would essentially create a new studio there, hire the local people, and train them, therefore investing in the local economy. In return, they would get a bunch of very generous subsidies. Well, it turns out that Ubisoft basically took the money and didn't do much else because it was known internally as the worst studio in the company. They gave their employees extremely small salaries, and the working conditions were so bad that some were comparing the treatment of the staff to the European colonization efforts of the old times. Quite sad for a studio that co-developed Assassin's Creed Valhalla and has obviously been working on a game that metaphorically represents themselves as well. Now, this is where the sexual allegations come in. Kotaku released an article stating that bad projects, even worse leadership, a bunch of sexual allegations, and racist acts have been plaguing the studio, and that Ubisoft was aware and basically did nothing. Also, the thing with this report is that it isn't a secluded incident, but a problem that had been happening everywhere in the company. Sexual allegations in the Montreal studio were made public earlier that same year. The same thing in the Toronto studio. Male employees would, metaphorically speaking, eat their female colleagues alive with their staring contest, and that's before mentioning that one of the co-founders of the studio strangled an employee during a work party. By the way, the director of Beyond Good and Evil 2 was also accused of sexual allegations and for his toxic management style. You get the idea at this point. All these reports came one after another in the same year, and the consensus was the following. Ubisoft had promoted these individuals to high-ranking positions, ignored or, in worst cases, sheltered these people as most of them were in the company for a decade or two, and basically did nothing to fix the situation. Now that it was made public, the studios were investigated and a bunch of people in leadership positions took turns leaving the company, and Eve promised that the situation would be resolved. Obviously. Too bad he didn't put his money where his mouth is, because 1 year later, it seems that not much was done to change the situation. Team leads changed, but the situation stayed basically the same. Complaints were made, but follow-ups weren't taken seriously, and since then, I'm not sure that things have changed. Nothing concrete has resurfaced, which means that either interest has fallen, which I doubt, or there's nothing to report on the matter. We know for sure that Ubisoft is really mismanaged, and that crunch culture is also a serious issue in most of its studios. The silver lining is that Ubisoft stated this year that it's on the right path following the sexual allegations without actually providing any proof or methodology, so yeah. Although, I do know a former colleague that worked for them until recently and stated that the company is somewhat in a better position than before. They fired most of the accused and changed the staff that worked on the HR department that wasn't escalating the issues. I was therefore told that things are better on that front, but the core problem that caused the situation to begin with wasn't actually addressed. That problem is the hierarchy found inside the studios and amongst themselves. Opinions weren't validated because either the position that the individual occupied in the company or because they were part of a team that was deemed inferior by others. Only time will tell if it actually got better on these fronts, but for the time being, it's important that we don't forget those affected by these issues while holding the companies accountable for the actions for their employees. Everyone deserves to work in a healthy and prospering environment, and it's mainly in those that great games are born. Same as before, if you work for Ubisoft or still are and feel like sharing your story, do either share it in the comments section below, or you can write me an email by going in the About section. One last thing before I move on to my last spicy bit of information. In October 2023, 5 former Ubisoft workers were arrested after a 1-year investigation following all the sexual allegations that surrounded the company. Among those 5 arrested were the Chief Creative Officer and the ex-VP of Editorial and Creative Services. Quite rough if I do say so myself, and I think that, for all those reasons that I mentioned so far, Ubisoft was looking for a potential buyer in 2022/2023. So this story is actually quite hard to talk about because what Yves says publicly and internally could hardly be any different. Although my contact did confirm as much, and online articles of non-related sources also stated the same thing, so take this information as rumor to the very least. Although from what I can find, they didn't find any success, and it seems that they were basically laughed at when the representatives of Ubisoft proposed different mergers and acquisitions. Honestly, I can't really blame them. Ubisoft isn't as mighty or as sought for as they were around the time when Far Cry 3 released. Assassin's Creed was at its prime, the company was growing rapidly, and the staff was innovating on every project. It went from a model company into one that's often the butt of a joke, which is honestly sad. One idea that specialists in the industry have brought forth, which I believe makes sense, is that they most probably expanded too fast, spread too far around the world, and all combined ended up getting more than what they could handle. On a press kit that was released in 2021, they stated that they have 45 subsidiary studios, which amounted to 20,000 team members. Add to the mix 90 nationalities and 65 spoken languages split all across 5 continents, and you can start to imagine just how colossal the task of managing all of them is. At the end of the day, I do actually sympathize with them. It's hard to run a company, let alone something as huge as all of Ubisoft. I just hope that they succeed in upping the quality of life for their studio, because their staff holds the key to their success. They have interesting IPs and a consumer base willing to spend money on their products. They just need to figure out a way to create a better and long-lasting work environment, so only time will tell what happens from here. Lastly, the last company on my AAA list before I summarize the whole video is Warner Brothers, which has had an interesting year, I would say. I know that their fans certainly had a lot to cherish and simultaneously complain about. Now, I'm not going to go in too deep on this one because from the gaming industry side of things, there isn't much to talk about, but what is there is really interesting indeed. For starters, Hogwarts Legacy outperformed basically everyone's expectations. It's been selling well and constantly staying high in the sale charts every month since its release, which makes it one of the best-selling, if not the best-selling game of 2023. It's actually been selling out well, to the point that it's been outselling newly released games like Armored Core 6 on its first week, even if it was already out for 6 months. It also generated $1 billion in revenue, and that number is only growing, so it just shows you how even bad publicity is publicity nonetheless, because man, anyone following the industry before the game was released is aware of how dedicated the opposition was in making this game fail in any way possible. Regardless of all that, the game was able to forge its own way forward and won the hearts of millions, so it was only natural that they would expect that Warner Brothers and the studio behind it would want to double dip and sell some DLCs, but nope. Instead, Warner Brothers opted in not putting any Quidditch in the game and made a whole new game around the fictional sport. I don't know about you, but I owned and I still own the Quidditch World Cup Harry Potter game on the GameCube, and I remember really enjoying it. You chose your team and fought in championships in order to prove that your team was the best of all the Wizarding World. Now, this decision had 2 implications, with the positive one being that it would allow the game to be more than just an add-on minigame. It's a standalone multiplayer-centered experience where you'll be able to compete against your friends and randoms on the internet, so So for the little information currently available, we can to the very least determine that it's something that will be engaging long term and won't be a basic mini game like what you would find in a Hogwarts Legacy game. Although, the negative here is that it probably also means that it will be littered with some form of microtransactions. I have two reasons to suspect this, with the first one being that, unlike what you might expect, the Harry Potter license hasn't actually been in a deep slumber. When EA stopped making Harry Potter games, Portkey sold their rights to studios that wanted to make basic mobile games, with the last one being universally hated on all fronts. It was a blatant cash grab that didn't hide the fact that it wanted money in order to do basic things in the game, which now leads me to the new Quidditch game. Making an online multiplayer game centered around the universally known sport will be too easy for them to add cosmetics, let alone pay to win stuff like from Call of Duty. Hell, Hogwarts Legacy has so many iterations of similar clothes that they made their resell the player's main way to making money. Plus, if that's not enough to deserve skepticism, Warner Brothers has also been very sketchy with their other big release of this year, Mortal Kombat 1. It sold almost 3 million copies in the first 2 months, which is decent compared to all other games in the series, but even so, it didn't stop Warner Brothers from being greedy. For the first time ever, they decided to sell fatalities in the add-on store in the game. This caused a storm in the community because fatalities were usually free and part of the additional content for the game. This time, however, Warner Brothers decided to charge $10 for a seasonal fatality in the game that already cost the $70 plus tax and featured paid cosmetics as well. Now, don't get me wrong, paid add-ons isn't anything new, especially in the fighting genre. Street Fighter 6, for example, is selling paid cosmetics of the TMNT Turtles, which are $15 each, or $60 for all 4. It's quite a ripoff no matter how you look into it, but this is the first time that fatalities are added into the mix. In other words, where is the limit? When will we get to the point that games will release mechanically unplayable and that paying for gameplay mechanics that should have already been there becomes the norm? We already saw a glimpse of what this could be in the past, with Konami charging $10 for each extra save slot in Metal Gear Survive. Now, with what happened with Mortal Kombat, it's easy to worry and wonder what will be next for Quidditch Champions when both parties involved are sketchy and demand has never been more present. To summarize everything that we've seen so far, I think that 2023 will be generally remembered in one of the two following ways. If you're a consumer like I am, you'll most probably remember it as being a really productive year where a bunch of hype releases flooded the market and in turn washed our savings away. More specifically, some of the highlights were Diablo 4, Baldur's Gate 3, RoboCop, Hogwarts Legacy, Final Fantasy XVI, Dead Space Remake, Atomic Heart, Alan Wake 2, Yakuza Like a Dragon Ishin, The Pale Beyond, and so much more. Although yes, for every Spider-Man game that was critically acclaimed and delivered in terms of quality, we also got the legends like Lord of the Rings Gollum, Skull Island Rise of Kong, and Redfall. The lows were indeed really low this year, but at the same time, at least they were few in numbers compared to everything else that was released, which is definitely awesome. Add into the releases of awesome gadgets like the OLED Steam Deck, the MetaQuest 3, the PlayStation VR 2, and more, and you start to realize just how varied the whole package is. Honestly, it's to the point that there's something to please everyone no matter what your interests are, which is a rare feat for most years. Although that's also just half of the story now, as now more than ever, 2023 will also be remembered as the year where we had a record amount of layoffs. On top of all those that I've already mentioned in this video, there's still a lot more that I haven't covered yet, like Amazon letting go of 184 employees from Twitch and Amazon Gaming. Outside of the gaming sphere, Amazon started the year by firing 17,000 employees and then adding another 9,000 to that number, bringing in the total to 26,000. Those drastic measures were led by the fear of the general recession that's supposed to hit the economy, which means that if Amazon was ready to take such imposing precautions ahead of time, then other companies are most definitely feeling the heat. Epic, for example, let go of 830 employees because, as stated by the CEO of Epic Games, they were spending more than they were actually making. Let me remind you that this is the same company that allegedly makes around $2.7 million on a normal day just on Fortnite alone. Basically, it confirms that their global strategies related to the Epic Games Store haven't actually been paying off as planned, and therefore drastic measures had to be taken in order to keep themselves away from their breaking point. Speaking of the breaking point, the studio that created a game called Boomerang shut down its doors because they couldn't find an investor to create their next game. Also, the game Boomerang currently sits on an all-time 95% positive on Steam, which honestly I just do not understand. Like, how can a game that acclaimed not be able to get any funding for the follow-up, especially because they've been working on the prototype for like 6 years. I think it's just more proof that the gaming industry isn't what it was pre-epidemic, and why studios invest as much as they do in making live service titles. The cost of making games has been skyrocketing for such a long time, so having a one-time purchase game is becoming less and less of a feasible thing to do, especially when you're part of a huge company that has multiple studios all over the world. I had planned to go more in depth into this, but my point is that we've lost about 9,000 posts just last year, which is an insane amount. Like, I can't even imagine how many families that affected. To make matters even worse, that many budget cuts in a small time period makes it practically impossible for talented individuals to get hired, as the demand is exponentially higher than the offering, so... yeah. Man. I just hope that 2024 will be better. Oh shit, what the fuck happened? Okay, so some of these were actually predictable, like Microsoft restructuring Activision Blizzard King and therefore removing posts that they deemed irrelevant. It's sad but unavoidable, as it doesn't make sense for them to keep departments that they won't actually need, like a publishing wing. Microsoft will publish all future Activision games, so it's understandable that they'd have to lay off some of the newly acquired staff. Although there's more to the story than it first entails, as they initially promised that they weren't going to make any major layoffs once the acquisition was complete, only to then let go of 1,900 devs from all around the company. On top of butchering both Activision and Blizzard, they also laid off some people from ZeniMax and shut down a department in charge of bringing games to the physical market. Therefore, it seems to me like Microsoft is not only downsizing Activision Blizzard King, but is also cleaning house on their side as well. Lastly, I want to also remind people that when Microsoft acquired ZeniMax and their subsidiaries, they didn't feel the need to restructure or commit to any major layoffs. I recommend that you do your own research on this one, as it is currently an ongoing situation, and I can guarantee that there's a lot more to this than what they want you to believe. What was less expected in my opinion would be how low Unity has fallen since its controversy in 2023. I had actually a full segment planned for Unity and their financial situation, but I had to cut it off as this video needs to be released at some point, and I've already been working on it for almost 3 months. The gist of it is that the experts at Unity no longer trust their current revenue stream. They state that 70% of the top 1,000 mobile games use their engine, but their revenue was capped at around $716 million last year. The problem is that Unity charges a fixed rate, unlike the Unreal Engine, for example, that charges a 5% revenue share. In other words, Unity has a scaling issue, which is only made worse by the fact that they were overvaluated for a very long time, showing the potential they would have had if the situation was different. What's even more surprising is that, since they went public in 2020, they weren't actually able to make any profit and were only kept going by outside investment and by a few side revenues like ads. When you combine all of those facts with the current economic situation, it makes a lot more sense as to why they ended up making such drastic changes. It led to 600 employees losing their jobs and the downsizing of their office locations, which went from 58 all the way to 30 last year. Then, they scrapped their agreement with Weta Digitals and laid off another 265 employees. This year, in 2024, they announced that another 1,800 employees were going to be let go, which honestly begs the question as to how they were able to sustain themselves up to this point if they decided to cut down more than 2,665 posts in the span of a year. It's honestly crazy that it had to come to this, as for all the research that I've did, the signs that the previous business model wasn't sustainable were all there. Mismanagement mixed with bad luck struck them hard, and now normal employees are paying the price. Also, in case you were curious, the CEO of Unity that stepped down because of the backlash from all the changes in the payment plans was able to secure an interesting exit package. Essentially, even if he publicly declared that he left the company, he's still going to remain in the employee list and continue to receive his salary until April 2024. Plus, that would also allow him to get access to stock options, which, if sold, would wield in $1.2 million. It's definitely not the golden parachute that Bobby Kotick got, but I still find it interesting that he was able to get as much while knowing that he's one of the causes that led the company to their current turmoil. What I find sad in all this is this kind of mismanagement seems to be the norm in the industry. Twitch, for example, has laid off 500 employees around the same time as Unity announced their layoffs, also for similar reasons. They stated they had paid $1 billion to streamers last year and that their revenue projections were over-optimistic, so they had to cut posts in order to make the company more efficient. A similar story happened to Riot, who let go of 530 employees on January 23rd. The CEO stated that they lacked focus and invested their resources in too many projects that weren't actually paying off as intended, so they had to rescope the company. If 2023 was the year of layoffs, 2024 would be the year of closures. This quote actually comes from an anonymous CEO that was interviewed for an article published by GamesIndustry.biz called "Games Industry Leaders Brace for Up to 2 Years of Pain." He brought some interesting points that I actually want to share with you, with the highlights being what follows, which states that a leading venture capitalist stated, "Why take the gamble sustainable with a game company when you can just stick the money in the bank and earn 5%? Interest rates put pressure on costs, and not just wages, but also insurance, travel, rent, and other business costs. Meanwhile, there is no room to raise video game prices to compensate. There is simply no tolerance for any further price moves, said one managing director. But a growing concern from the publishers we spoke to is the abundance of games being released across all platforms. Too many games were greenlit in 2020 and 2021, one publisher boss said. We need to get to pre-pandemic levels in terms of release schedule, and that's probably going to take 2 years. You can already see publishers signing fewer games. That's happening everywhere. The stores are saturated, not just Steam, but the games just aren't delivering the levels they were. Now, I know that this has been super negative so far, and it doesn't really fit the tone for the rest of the video, so I want to end it on a more positive light and say, thank you. Thank you for all those that work in the industry and for making games that inspire us. Thank you for making us dream of other worlds and have something to look forward to as we come back from our long days at work. Thank you for working as hard as you are and for doing your best even if everything seems to be crumbling around us. Thank you for inspiring me to make this channel and subsequently this video, because it is that kind of inspiration that made me want to make this video over everything else that I had planned so far, because I actually had to cancel like 3 of my videos in order to make this one work. Thank you for playing your part no matter how small it is. Me and a million of other people around the world really appreciate it, and I genuinely hope that it gets better soon. Hey, so a quick heads up before I actually finish this video. I want to thank you for your patience. Essentially, like I stated a few seconds ago, I was actually planning to make a bunch of other videos, but I've underestimated the scale of this project. Even if I knew what I was actually going to talk about, let's say about 70% of it, I had to find all the proof and verify and then go further on. So this ended up ballooning, and like I stated, I had to also cut the Unity part and just, half-ass through it. So I recommend that you do your own research when you get the chance. So anyways, thank you for actually watching the video to the very end and for supporting. I really appreciate it. And with all that said, I wish you all a good day, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye now.